All right, welcome back, everybody. Our recess is over. We will turn now over to Dr. Adley for an update to the board on the fall opening of schools. Dr. Adley.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and good afternoon to those people who are watching this being live streamed. Thank you. So I want to take a wee bit of an opportunity, obviously. Today, I don't have a major presentation of a very detailed plan for people. I've just sort of got issues that I'm just going to walk you through and just sort of talking points. So I'd like to give the board, obviously, a flavour of, okay, so what's this shaping up like? How are we doing with the plan? It is obviously for next Friday to be submitted to the Commissioner. The staff has been working diligently since school completed to continue the work. Obviously, we just over a week ago or so, 2 weeks ago, we got the direction from the state. It seems to be like a moving target ever since, but that's okay. So I'll just sort of give you how things are coming together, and there are consistencies and there are inconsistencies. As you look at how practices just in general at the moment around COVID-19 is happening in society around us, you can see consistencies and inconsistencies in practices. But this will give you a wee bit of a sense, and I'd also like, feedback from the board. That'll give us a sense of kind of some of the things that you're thinking about, you've heard from constituents or otherwise, and it'll also give us a direction to contemplate sort of moving forward. So with that, so just give you a wee bit of, I think the board knows that we went through the process of establishing early on a district reopening task force, and there was over 50 people who participated on that task force. Primarily, it was staff, and we did not have parents on at that particular time. That was a conscious decision at that point, because I thought we needed administratively to take an introspective look at the issues. The main purpose of that was to look and see what were the new learnings, or how was it informed by the practices we had just finished. The kids had just come off a couple of months, teachers have just come off a couple of months, and is there any new learnings there that we could take away? And so we looked at under operations, special education, social and emotional learning, teaching and learning. So those were the major areas of sort of focus. And just process-wise, because I can understand how it may be a bit of confusion for people, we established that early before we had any state plan. And the purpose was, what's the learning? What are the recommendations that would inform a plan to be developed? Right, so that we used the state plan, and we used this set of recommendations to start to put the plan together. So that was basically it. We did solicit stakeholder feedback. We had good parent and staff feedback on what their learnings were, what their wishes were. Yesterday we concluded a focus group. We had about 33. If I take off my staff, we had about 27 or so parents across the district, representing all the schools, who participated in the focus group to give us some tangible feedback. So that is timely feedback, because the way the plan is coming together, every day something develops and there's some new news. And actually yesterday there was some new news on the financing, and then we have to submit the plan by July 24th. If you want me to talk through the big talking points and then we'll just open it up, is that okay?
Yeah,
please. Because I'll just go quickly, right, and give you the big ideas. So we had some guiding principles. The safety of the students and staff always comes first. Decisions, as in this district has always been, are made in the best interest of all the children. Equitable conditions for all students to access their learning. Yes, we had to align it to the state guidelines and research, and I'll say, fine-tuning between requirement, guideline. We took the spirit of what they wanted us to do. As it proved out, that is kind of what they're wanting us to do, in terms of come back all 5 days, that type of stuff. So we embraced that as much as possible. To embrace innovation and innovative thinking here if we can. This is an opportunity to do that. And I think the various plans have to be sort of adaptable, because we might start off with a third one or the second one. And if you have a structure in two that's not coherent with one, then kind of you can't really do it seamlessly. And you have to be able to transition from one to another. It doesn't really matter what my opinion is or our board members' opinion, because in the sense of how much confidence do I have starting in 5 days and actually even getting into a hybrid? It might jump, or it might start with a hybrid. I mean, who knows what the next couple of weeks brings us. So we tried to make it nimble in that regard, and also to be clear about our communication, and to be regular and succinct in our communication. So we had to develop 3 models. So all children returning to school 5 days a week, the hybrid model, return to school, and the remote model. That would suggest that it's linear in nature, but who knows, right, if it's going to be. But so again, I should have introduced some of the staff, but I think you know most of the people here, so thank you for joining us. Elise is our COVID expert and director, actually, since we had the appointment. Thank you for being here. So for the return to school, that's everybody 5 days a week, and that's currently what we are planning to do at this particular point. With that particular program, there is an option, as you know, they give parents an option to keep their children at home for whatever reason, right? And that's not really required to say whether it's a personal reason, medical reason, or otherwise. So we have to be adept at that. We did send out some surveys to parents, asking them, would you be sending your child? We also asked, would you be riding the bus? We also did the staff in terms of noticing of travel, just what we discussed this morning with Attorney Mooney. So, sorry, it's just so with this particular model, right, sounds okay, but the devil's in the detail a little bit. One, who's coming back, both adults and students, and particularly with students who may choose not to come back. How do we address that? I do want to say I want to pay tribute to all the staff who participated in the task force, and also, I may say, to the union. Now, the union, in some of these issues, right, they have been very supportive. They participated in the reopening task force. We're in close communication. They're very supportive, but you can understand to some degree they're worried about some things, right, and have most worries perhaps around how we do remote learning. So the last week or so, using the word transparency and all transparency, has been a week to take this and start make decisions, right, because we have to make certain decisions. So the nature, it's funny that we have this instrument right in front of us. It's not exactly what we're thinking, but basically we would be doing, the proposal at this point is to do live streaming for people who are not in the classroom. So essentially, if my board chair was the teacher, this would be actually sitting here.
You'd be in trouble?
Yeah. So this sort of nature, there's not going to be 5 of them for 5 people who are out. So that's not really the nature of it. Now, obviously, the e-learning or remote learning that goes along with that is, I've sort of stuck between, we would like all the children in, but we have to respect what our medical profession has said in the state of Connecticut to give people an option. There's a reason they're giving them an option to stay out. So while we'd like them to come in, we also have to be as innovative and creative and deliver the curriculum and the teaching and learning with as best fidelity as possible. So this is the model currently that's on the table for the return to school. We will see how many children decide not to return to school. I think the indicator that we had may have been like 3 or 4 kids, maybe a class, right? If you took the percentage, would not return to school. That's if you just averaged it out, right?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, Alan?
Yeah.
When we looked at when we looked at the return, how many students? The worst scenario, right? The worst scenario would have been about, if you averaged it like 3 or 4 a class, is what I looked at.
A grade or a class? Sorry, because elementary you booked.
I think it was a class, what I looked at.
So is that based off of our survey or statewide data?
This is based off our survey. Now, there was a caveat there. Some people had it depends, and so I'm giving sort of, now people can change their mind, right? So they will have an ability. That's the other part of this. They can change their minds. They can change their mind for education. They can change their minds for transportation. So that's kind of just that particular model. The hybrid model. So essentially, the hybrid model, and we'll talk about cohorts in a moment. What's on the table is some sort of form of 2 days in school, 2 days out of school, on e-learning. So, for instance, let's say you're a first grader, you maybe come to school Monday, Wednesday, and you'll be home Tuesday, Thursday. Friday, if we get to that point, would be a half day of e-learning. No one in the building. The building would be all deeply cleaned. In the afternoon, teachers would have professional learning because there's still a lot of that going on. So essentially, it's going to be some heading towards some version of that, but actually it'll probably be that version. Now, what that looks like in cohorts, we can talk about that. And the remote learning is remote learning. What we heard back predominantly about the remote learning mode, can we have more direct live instruction for the e-learning scenario that we've already been through for the last couple of months, essentially. Those are the three models. Again, you don't have to. We are trying to support the intention of starting with the return to school. We have looked at obviously classrooms, putting kids in classrooms. Can we space it? And we'll talk about that. I'm going to cross over because all these things sort of cross over themes, cross over back and forth. Social distancing. So one of the recommendations from the task force and actually from the American Academy of Pediatrics is the 3 feet. We cannot do it with 6 feet. Right? It's not going to be possible to do it with 6 feet spacing. Through this practice, I want to recognize Alicia here for all of her efforts. Alicia's our Director of Nursing, in case someone doesn't know her. And we have been working very closely with the town and the Public Health Director and Dr. Kennefic, our medical advisor. So we would not put these out if they weren't supported, right? And bear in mind, to start with, the state of Connecticut is relatively supporting them. So it's with that type of spacing that Mike Lynch did his thing, and principals have been off looking at buildings. So there's things like, you may have a size of a classroom in one classroom that's too many, but somebody else has one that's too few. You can get away with swapping those, right? So it's not just, so they're making use of the spaces as best they can. Essentially, if you see a classroom, it will look like maybe what we grew up with, I guess, right? Just desks and rows. There's a line for the teacher, just to get the sense of where that social distancing line is. The masks are required for all students and staff. We had a wee discussion this morning. We will work with people on the mask issue. It's not an easy thing. I tend to think if I've learned anything in education over the years, and this is a big test. This tests it big time. Kids tend to adapt quicker to environments than we do, right? So with good education up front, with good practice up front, with good modeling up front, with good communication, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be the same, but I think we can accomplish that. So cohorting is essentially where you're putting teams of, for want of a better term, teams of kids together with the students and their teacher. There's ways to do that, and there's struggles with that. There's inconsistency with that, right? If you look at when students leave our school system and go home and go into other town organizations and all, there's all sorts of cross-population, right? And there's only so much that we can do in that regard. But essentially, for the elementary schools, for the most part, the elementary schools is the classroom, right? So that's an easier model to actually think about. On the bus, I'll just travel, like on the bus when they're cohorting, we can't, the plan, the directions from the State Department recognizes you do the best you can for social distancing, right? So we will have two to a seat. They will be named on where they are and they're located, because if so happens that you need it for tracing, you know where someone is and within 6 feet there who was there, that type of stuff. That's all what Alicia Rich is working on. And actually, you wouldn't be able to get drivers or buses. Even a while back, you wouldn't have been able to get them. So that's something that's just, well, that's a variable, right? When we asked the parents, are you going to come on the bus, there was about 10% less than what we did last year. So about 90% capacity. The best we'll do is pick up those spacing, right? But essentially that would be it for that. Cohorting at the middle school, primarily around your, it's going to be primarily around the grade level. The students, there'll be a change in schedule. The students will receive, their teachers will come to them, right? Predominantly for the core subjects, English, math, science, social studies. There will be some pull-outs for some other things, because support services or otherwise, we have to recognise that. And we are trying to sort of keep it normal as a day as possible, but the schedule will change somewhat. I think you heard earlier on about lunch. I don't know where it came up, but it came up about middle school lunch. They're looking at different places in the building. Elementary is looking at pushing it into the classroom. We just approved a food service who are ready to hit the platform running to help us out with that. High school is a little bit different, right? Look, plainly put, it's not possible to do social distancing as in the way that we are thinking about it or constructing it. But perhaps there's a way to limit people's exposure to each other, students' exposure to greater numbers of students, and that is fundamentally the structure that they're thinking about. That has not been completely finalised, but it will look something like there's some aspect of a modified schedule. It could be 1 to 4, where they meet actually either 1 to 4 and 4 through 8 the next day, or 1 to 4 for the full semester, which would reduce the movement around periods 5, 6, 7, and 8, if you sort of, right? Semester.
Semester or quarter?
Sorry, semester I meant to say.
Okay.
Potentially a semester.
Sorry, can you then go back? I lost
So one of the models is to look at students take classes 1, 2, 3, and 4 for longer double blocks, essentially. But you do that for the semester. I know what everybody's thinking. AP, this, right? And that's, we try and get a balance for that. We're working with Meg Mallinson. This isn't solidified, so I want to make that particularly clear. I'm giving you one of the models of it, but it's essentially going to be one of these types of things where the blocks will come. You could do the same thing by going 1 through 4 and then 5 through 8 the next day, right? So it'd be the same type of concept, but they're also considering that model of doing 4 classes for the semester, 4 classes for the second semester. There's pros and cons of that. If you were looking at the health benefits of that, I think that they're sort of clear in some ways, right? Less movement around the building. They're looking at they're bringing in the cohort 9 through 10 and 11, 12. Now, yes, there's crossover classes, but we would manage those as best as possible, or by doing it alphabetically, bringing A through K and L through Z in. So they haven't sort of finalised it, but that's it. One of the models is going to be fundamentally the same in one way or another, and I give them a lot of credit for all of their efforts to do this thinking and to try to come up with a. It's not going to be perfect, but we also have to realise we're trying to keep kids healthy and safe, right, at the same time.
And it's temporary.
And
It's a year.
And it's temporary.
I have a question, but before I ask it, I just want to be clear. It's in the spirit of thank you all for all the work you're doing, and I understand this is really complex. But one of the questions I keep getting asked is, how are we managing for least restrictive environment when we have to move into a cohorting model? And I'm sure that's different at different levels, but I'm assuming you thought of it.
We have I'll take this one out of order. Is that okay?
Yeah, and then let's run through all of them and go back to the question.
But I'll just answer it since we're here. I'll say this: least restrictive environment has been a point of discussion at several meetings, many meetings. It came up again yesterday with their parents. I'll say it doesn't have to come up because it's very much in our mind of not creating, of maintaining that. Now, it might be that we may not maintain the ratio we have now. We may have to give a little bit in ratio and being honest about that. But maintaining those least restrictive environments. And actually, I don't want any population of students to be profiled through this process. So I appreciate the question. We're looking at that. Containment, tracking, and cancellation protocols. Well, I have my expert here. When we open it up, she'll address some of that. But fundamentally, the State Department of Education and Public Health are meant to give us directions. I'm not going to wait on that, really. Like, I mean, it's... I'm not... I don't know when that's going to come, what shape it's going to be, and in all honesty, you're probably as good a guess as any of us in terms of what would that look like. Like, I mean, it could be different from one community to the other community. We also have to, Alicia and I have to communicate very closely with the Director of Public Health and our medical advisor, and they work very collaboratively with us and helpful to us. So on many of these issues, we'll be going back to them. Like, okay, here's a new issue that's developed, either something we anticipated or not, around tracking, containment, the cancellation protocols. But Alicia can talk a wee bit more about those in a wee bit more detail. Operations of transportation, I just spoke about a little bit. Lunches up and down the system. If I didn't touch on it, the high school's still up in the air a little bit. But the idea of putting all those children in there is like it's a mismatch, really. So they're looking at potentially other spaces or classrooms, which is unusual. Outside spaces, I'll go out of order and just ramble a little bit. Outside spaces, people are looking. It'd be nice for. One of the suggestions we got was like, it'd be nice for be able to take your class outside somewhere, right, and even socially, emotionally connect with them, right. And as far as we can, using spaces. I know the principal's looking at the ends of the schools of opening those up for kids to come out and giving other kids more privileges to be outside a little bit. That poses safety, right? So we'll have to be very careful about that and what our safety plans are. Facilities is clearly an important component of this. If it's not ticking up in your mind right now, just pick up some of the dollars in your mind right now, because there's certain things that we need. And I'll certainly get to that. We are going to need a couple of LPNs because we have to have a secluded room where students can go, and you can't put a teaching assistant in there, you can't put just a regular staff member in there. So those are things that we're going to do. Facilities will probably have probably 7 part-time staff that we're going to need to do the cleaning that we have to do on an ongoing basis. We do have some part-time staff in the summer, so if you think of that model for during the year, we'll need that because the cleaning and extra disinfectant that's going to happen. The bus transportation between runs, right, between the high school and middle school, the buses have to be cleaned again, and so on and so forth. So all of this here sort of starts to accumulate. The facilities, staff understandably are worried about, because it talked about air quality in the actual report. So there is an independent contractor coming out to look at all of our systems to make sure that if we have to do any improvements, we will, right? We may not be able to get it to hospital standards. I don't think we're going to do that. That's not going to happen. But we certainly have to be responsive and would want to be responsive for our staff and our children in the building. So whatever improvements we have to do there, as identified through that process, we're working through that. There'll be different hand sanitizers and what am I looking for? What's it called?
PPE.
Hand washing stations, thank you. That will be going in different locations when children are having lunch, when they come into the building, different places. The school calendar, I was going to bring a school calendar adjustment, and then the state 2 days ago came out with a notice you can reduce school by 3 days. Well, what the committee had sort of suggested was take the 3 professional learning days, the full days during the year, and front load those for professional learning. It would still keep the calendar essentially the same, just the professional days would change. Now you probably will have to take action as a board because to officially change the calendar now, because what they have proposed is kind of what we said. So we will take the 3 days because our staff needs it on technology, e-learning, so on and so forth, and keep the 3 professional days that we have during the year anyway. So that will require some action on our behalf, on the board's behalf. So opening of school days, there's plans that we're trying to do for the opening of schools to address the students' needs. What are they going to see in the first couple of days? It was very helpful yesterday to hearing the parents in terms of what their anxiety is or what would be beneficial to them in terms of the district is putting together videos and other helpful resources for parents so that we can get a sort of jump start on this before the end of the year. We would probably, I think the first 3 days would probably be half days. As we work through this, we have a transition for staff, and I think we're going to have a transition for students. The social emotional learning was very much a part of it. We had a whole committee on board with that, and that will be built into the day consciously as part of the day. Clearly, actually, this goes to what Jill just asked about, support services. We want to make sure that there's equity of accessibility there to those actual resources. What we heard about is when we part of the focus groups and the actual return to school committee. And actually, one of the takeaways from last year on the survey was, can we hear more a wee bit about assessment, feedback for students on progress? And I think that's probably fair, right, from our experience last year. And what would we do in that regard? And so you're sort of looking at formative assessments. What's the assessments for learning that's going to change a teacher's practice in order to accommodate where the child is at this particular point. And then the professional development is primarily going to focus on SEL, the e-learning, remote learning, and use of the technology. We are likely going to I think we are just going to go to Zoom completely. Yes, we'll use Google Classrooms, but not Google Meet or anything else. We've committed to Zoom. We will have to. I shared a bit about the cameras. This is going to cause greater bandwidth, and greater bandwidth costs more money. The document cameras that we're going to get, now I'm saying, in all honesty to you, I have to make some decisions, and with very restrictive, time is one, right, and processes, and the later we order something, the more difficult, even on a good day right now, it's going to be hard to get some of this stuff. So we need to get the document cameras. The document cameras will be very helpful because they will not be wasted. Teachers will use them in classes anyway. They'll also be transferable to take them home to use if we go straight to e-learning.
What are they called again? Sorry,
this is not a document camera.
Document,
yeah.
Okay,
but that is not one. It sort of looks like it, but it's not. But for the purpose of this discussion, it works well. And I'll finish I thought the best way was just to open it up for questions, connections, disconnects. Now that's a big number, right? Easily now we're sitting at 650,000, right? And I'll show you some of what those are. Plexiglass, document cameras. As you see on the right-hand side, there's things to be determined. I may need a teacher or two. That's still a work in progress. We have a couple of things just to finalise. I want to thank the staff, both central services staff, the staff who are on the committee, our administrators, because they're trying to be very creative in terms of how they do things. We also have, Richard, I don't think this includes the 135 of... It doesn't, does it?
So some of these items would be applied to the 130.
Can you just speak into the mic, because I think, yeah, thanks.
So there's an ESSER grant through the state, which was through the CARES Act, and Darien was awarded approximately $134,000. So some of these items could be applied towards that. These are also items that could be potentially submitted to FEMA for reimbursement. But because it's a reimbursement, you'd obviously have to shell out the money first and then wait for the reimbursement if we get it.
So you heard today Tom talk about superintendent. Oh, sorry.
CARES Act. Is that money guaranteed? Didn't that go to the town?
So they have awarded us $134,000, but the state has frozen the grant application based on feedback from the U.S. Department of Education. So we're waiting for that to be unfrozen before we can apply. Yeah,
they froze that 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Have you heard Tom Mooney today talking about we have to submit something tomorrow. These are the types of things that, right? If I may, just hold off on the budget issues, because I would perhaps talk about the program and processes first, and then, but this is a conundrum though, because some of these stuff I got to get now.
So it's more than a conundrum, and I think we're going to have to talk as a board how we expedite this. In OPC, I did mention to Mr. Zagrodzky
Oh, sorry.
costs. I didn't have a cost list in front of me, so we can talk about it, but I'd like to signal to the chairman some of these costs just to start making his ticker tick. And
Definitely need to start those discussions.
because we're going to have to figure out process-wise how to do it, not let process get in the way of kids, but follow the correct process. Mr. Brown?
Just this number that we're looking at, the 653, is that day one, what we need to do to open, or is this for the entire school year projected? I just want to make sure I understand what I'm looking at.
Well, it's yes, we need it for day one, but it also we'll need it for.
So it's a combination, so this will be
Yep.
throughout next year.
Yep.
Thank you.
But, so.
And again, I know this
don't
is all estimates at this point, but I just want to make sure what the scope was.
Yeah, so just picking up off of that, Alan, like if we're at 653 on July and our planning as of July, what's today?
16th?
Yep.
Okay.
16.
And then the other,
Where does the million come from then? Is that the estimate beyond this?
Well, there's TBDs, so I would imagine.
Well, there's TBDs here, but there's other things that we have to sort of play out, whether I need other staff or otherwise. I mean, I wouldn't suggest potentially going back for 6 and then go back for 1, or at least to have the
Go
discussion.
back, go once.
Thought about from a facility standpoint, I haven't seen it here, I know you and I have talked about it, some other districts have ordered tents, set up additional facilities to get them more space.
So,
I'm sure you assess that, and then the other question is from a people standpoint, if you're gonna have more people driving to these schools, what do we need in terms of traffic people and traffic coordinators and stuff to start any construction and changing going in and out of these schools, but that's something I'm sure you have on list.
hi, Michael. So all my colleagues are here, and anybody, come on up, Michael. Come up to the table.
Maybe
Right
just
there.
square.
Oh, you can't. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. So the transportation of people coming to school is an ongoing issue, as is just the start of the school day. We can't have children running into the school cross-populating, right? So people need to be there to supervise right away. So there's potentially they're staggering school or otherwise, but that's still that is still to be determined. We did not go down. We did not go down the route of tents. We are just exploring using some of the outside spaces, but we didn't go down the route of the tent.
Alan, if we have staff that, for whatever reason, can't come back to work, does this estimate take into account any additional, I don't see any additional teaching staff up there.
6, yeah, we're gonna need,
Well, I guess,
Count
can you
for
just give the
substitutes.
survey results on that? What, we got the number of how many students maybe wouldn't come back. Do you know approximately how many staff are starting the school year saying they, for whatever reason, may not be coming back for?
So the initial results of the survey are 17% of the staff, but that's a tough number. They're going to involve individual conversations because there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and having a disability that requires an accommodation. So right now, it's 17%, and I'm scheduling meetings, but until we have a definite plan of what the school year looks like, you can't figure out what kind of accommodation might be necessary.
but I'm sorry, March, as of right now, it's potentially 17% of staff may not return to in-school learning.
Right. And only 485 answered the survey, so I send it to everybody, not just teachers, so we don't have 100% response rate.
Yeah.
But Alan, to Tara's point, these cameras, a teacher who may not feel comfortable teaching in a classroom can take that camera home, and could the class learn, meaning do we have to hire someone to cover that class, or can that teacher teach it from their home to a live class?
So that question is still up in the air as a legal question.
I was going to say, is that in-person teaching?
Well, I don't know, but
Right.
I mean, but it goes to the staffing question of, do we need money to hire?
Well, yeah, so just to build on that, if someone's teaching a class remotely, but the children are still in the classroom, wouldn't you still need someone in the classroom to monitor that class? So now you're adding another personnel. So we can permit the teachers to teach remotely, but we still need another person to monitor that class,
Yeah,
especially with younger students.
Well, there's different. There's. You still need the teacher who that teacher, the group of kids that teacher is going to teach, right?
So, but to John's question, with a little bit of what Katie and Deb are saying, if your next slide is we could be up to $1 million, I'm
Yes.
missing staff there. And it looks like we're at 653 and we haven't included staff. We might be hiring people, so I understand this entire pandemic is chicken and egg, right? Like, which do we do first? But
Yeah.
if we have to go out and hire, we're opening schools, hiring in September is going to be difficult. So
Well,
At
and is it a
some point,
hire or
if
is it a sub, depending how long, right? I mean, those are, it could be.
Well, and Jill, then I'll see you. My only point is, I think when we go back to the Board of Finance, if that's the will of this board, once we get all the information, I would like to go back comprehensively. I don't want to go back to them every week. They don't want to see me or any of us every week.
Well,
So
and- yeah.
I'd like to filter in all a reasonable person would assume we need, not like a wish list, but like a reasonable plan when we go back to them.
And I don't know if there's any way to structure it like a working capital line. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what comes to mind, where it's like, okay, we're not exactly 100% sure because we're not going to know maybe until we get further down the line, but we have access to X dollars because we know it could potentially reach X dollars, but we don't necessarily.
And
may
we're in a
not
little
need
bit
all.
of a different now with the special appropriation. So Jill and then John.
So I do think we probably want to go back. I would agree with going back with sort of a comprehensive view, but still leaving open the idea that we are learning as we go and this is an evolving
Yeah,
process.
absolutely.
So I think both things at the same time, if we could. In terms of thinking about personnel as flags, I think that there might be different ways to staff a remote. I'm sure programmatically you've thought about it. You could run a cohort of third graders, for
Correct.
example, with a single teacher. So.
And if the teacher, it could be one of those teachers who are home or not.
Right,
So
right. But I do think that we just saw New Canaan has 10 additional students. We've heard certainly anecdotally that the number of, or not anecdotally, but factually, the number of people who have changed their address from New York to Connecticut is up from 1,000 last year to 10,000 this year. So I think there's a reasonable expectation we could have a class go over the bubble. We did build that in, but I think from a just even if we don't have, if we have a TBD indicating that we could have a staff cost in terms of teachers, and then the other TBD I think would potentially be whether there's any cost built into some of the leave and things like that that quarantining may cause to our budget. We may not be able to predict at this stage what that looks like, but I think we can certainly flag that our expectation is that the requirements of quarantine may affect our budget in these ways.
John?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, and then we'll.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Are there any savings related to COVID? We had, number of line items that we saved from, in the last semester. I realized that was e-learning, but I'm thinking of, sports, or we haven't even, touched upon some of the extracurriculars and what the cost might be around that. So have you factored any of that in?
So do you mean projected savings?
Yeah, I mean, I want to, if we're going to go back to, we will go back, there's no if, when we go back to the Board of Finance and the RTM, they're going to see the puts and the takes and a net revision number. So not just what are your added expenses, what are your projected savings too. If there are any, there might not be any. So there might be additional costs associated with extracurriculars. I don't know that answer.
So the extracurricular, this is what I'm curious of the board actually perspective. So athletics, we've got an athletic director here. Athletics are sort of scheduled to proceed a little bit tentatively. I don't know how they're going to do some of these contact sports. If we ever get to the winter, wrestling or otherwise. But anyway, that continues to be a discussion. And we still have to round out the discussion about extracurricular activities, after-school activities for the school, and co-curricular activities. So those are things that I would say from my own position, I'd like to try and see is there a way to do some of those if they're socially distanced. If ones don't make sense, then that's a different discussion. And regarding whether there's savings in that, we will continue to look at that as a variable.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine before we'd go back to the Board of Finance, if we had any projected savings, we would have taken that off this number because it is ours to transfer and appropriate. So by the time we go back to the Board of Finance, we would have used up any projected savings. And so we wouldn't be saying, oh, you can anticipate a savings over here to offset. We'd be going back with a bottom line. We need this. We've already either approved and or the administration has transferred. Where we go.
I'd be reluctant at this point anyway to be projecting a savings somewhere. If it made sense and obvious, yes. I don't know, Richard, if there's anything that...
So typically you'd look at the budget as a whole, and if, let's say you have salary savings in different areas, you'd want to apply that to this first. If there's grant opportunities, you'd want to apply that to this first. We do have a portion of budget control. If that ends up not being used, that could be a potential avenue for either the LPNs or the custodians. So you'd want to look at all those avenues before you kind of set a final number of a request.
Dennis.
Do we have anything on testing? Is that something we would have to pay for? Is that the state? Or is there a plan to test students?
So I'll say we have no plan on site to test students, and I'll defer to Alicia to give you what the sort of plan is, so to speak, or at least a tenth of where we are right now.
Can I just add on to that? Can I just add, and adding on to testing, is there any plan to do temperature checks?
No, but we're going to...
Okay.
So,
No, let's talk to it now, please.
Temperature checks.
Is your microphone on?
I think Jeff's turning it on in the back, maybe.
It's on.
Oh, it's on, I'm just not loud enough, sorry. Okay, so temperature checks have not really been shown to, fevers aren't necessarily presenting symptom of COVID-19. So the amount of time that we will take to check everyone's temperature as they're walking through the door is really not a valuable use of time, and doesn't have any predictive value as to whether or not a student has COVID. We are strongly recommending that each parent, each staff member do their own temperature check before they leave their homes in the morning. And I realize that, we're asking people to do something they may or may not do. But that's kind of been the prevailing thought. And we are not the only district that is not doing temperature checks for students as they walk in the door. The other problem with that is to be able to do that, you're going to end up with a bottleneck of kids trying to enter a building. Now you're trying to socially distance or physically distance students, and you won't be able to maintain that physical distance to be able to do a temperature check. The other piece of that is the privacy issue. So if you have a student who walks through the door who has a temperature, then they're immediately separated from the group of students, and all those students now know that student with the fever has been removed to be, to go see the nurse. So it just, there's no privacy with it. And then, sorry, I thought of the other thing.
I think Dennis's question was, what do we have any plans for testing, and or what does that look like?
Yes, the testing. So any student or staff member who presents to a health office during the school day with any symptoms of COVID will be immediately isolated, and staff member will be asked to leave, will be waiting for a student's parent to come pick them up, and they will be referred to their healthcare provider. But we will not be doing any testing of students in the school or requiring that for school entry. Testing is really only good for the minute that you test, and So to ask students to do it a week before school starts, you may keep some students out, but the majority will probably, if they're negative, it is only valuable for that moment. So they could expose themselves over the week later and enter the school. So that's why we're doing all the other things, like the PPE. We're requiring masks for all students who can wear them. There'll be exceptions to that based on medical need, or if they have other special circumstances, then we'll kind of deal with those case by case. Teachers will be wearing masks and face shields, so we'll be protecting them as well. And the testing really gets done outside of our buildings and managed there by a provider.
So, Mrs. Stein.
So for the student or staff that presents symptoms, are we requiring they have a negative test to come back to school? Are they required to tell if it's a positive test? Like, how are we addressing the cohorting? And if someone does have COVID, there are privacy issues, I understand that, but so
we're working on all those criteria still. I've been talking with Dr. Kennefick and David Knopf around what that will look like. My initial planning is that if a student who has been in school and in a cohort for more than 15 minutes, because that's the time it takes, they're saying it takes at least 15 minutes in a group to potentially transmit COVID, is that cohort would be isolated and they would move to online learning for 2 weeks with their teacher. That student would be asked to be tested. If they had a positive test, then we would go from there as to what we would do. Other students, if they would be tested, or they would be waiting to see if they have symptoms. The student who had a positive test would be tracked and then have to be symptom-free, and then we would have to decide if we would require negative tests for them to come back, or if a clearance note from a physician would be enough for them to come back.
So, Alicia, I understand all of this is so complicated. So some of the questions I think we're asking is because we know the community is going to ask, or we're watching.
Right.
But I am with you 100%, both on removing children from a line and kind of the rumors that presents, the bottleneck of kids coming in. I think that all really presents operational logistical problems. But I want to make sure whatever we do, and we don't have to answer today, our messaging is clear. If we're asking parents to test at home for a fever, we're asking kids that come down to isolate with a fever and or test before we come back, but then we're saying testing is not a presenting symptom of COVID. I understand the people saying, well, then why am I testing at home, and why is my kid being told he needs a COVID test to come back? So whatever that message is, I think we need to address what seems, at least to like the lay person, as some contradictory information. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it might be because logistically it's not safe for us to test your kids. Or it might be that because if your kid was sick enough to come down to us, then we're requiring a COVID test. But as I'm taking notes, if a temperature isn't a presenting factor of COVID.
Well, it won't always be a fever a reason they would come to, if a student presents, if a student is in a classroom and they're coughing, not just one little cough, but they're persistently coughing, and they're saying that they feel nauseous, or they've lost their sense of taste or smell, or whatever, any of the symptoms around COVID, which are similar for pediatric students as strep throat, pneumonia, bronchitis. There's 100 other things it could be with kids and with adults. But if they're sent to the health office and they are assessed by the nurse, and it's determined that they are at risk for COVID, they will be asked to go home and be evaluated by their provider. If their provider at that point determines that they are likely have COVID, then it will be up to the provider to order a COVID test or not. They might just say, it looks like COVID, you have COVID, you need to stay home for 14 days, and then we would treat it as a COVID case, and then we would do all of our isolation of other students that are direct contacts.
No, but even that's a great clarification. If a medical professional determines it's a risk for COVID. So I just think as we message the communities, maybe like crafting those
At the same time, if that were to happen, we sent a student home or a staff member home that we thought is presumed to have COVID, then the next call I would be making would be to David Knopf at the health department and Dr. Kennefick, and then we would be deciding, do we isolate just that class? Do we isolate that grade? Do we close the school? You know, what are our next steps?
No, Jill, and then we'll.
So just one more thing. The guidance for that is we are anticipating that is coming from the State Department of Education, the State Department of Public Health. We are still waiting for that. So we are kind of making our own anticipated guidelines around that while we await that hopefully very clear final information. But otherwise, I'm working with David Knopf and Dr. Kennefick to make sure we have a solid plan around what we think we will do, and we would adjust it based on what comes from the state.
Okay. Jill?
So I appreciate this is complicated, and thank you for, again, thank you for the work you're doing. And for this conversation about communication protocols. I think as a board member looking through the packet, what I'd like to be sure that I see in the body of work that is part of reopening is explicitly in here the communication protocols for when a child is infected. That those protocols, I do understand, I've heard that the State Department is planning to do that, but I want to make sure that it's written in here that we will develop communication protocols in the case of infection, that we are working with the state, our local health department. And I think some of that's sort of embedded in here, but both inside of the communication workflow and inside of the health and wellness workflow. I just would like to see it called out more clearly than it is.
The format from the summary of recommendations is not the format of our plan.
Okay.
Right? So this will be delineated as many other aspects that we're talking about now will be fully delineated.
Okay.
Right,
Yes.
so parents would know, everybody in the community would know if we have a positive case, how that notification will go out.
Okay.
If we have a suspected case, how that notification would go out, and who it would go to,
Great.
I don't know if we would do it by, that hasn't really been determined yet, but that's part of the planning.
Okay, thank you.
So I know Mike, I'll have you jump in. I know it sounds silly, but in some ways, like our LICE model is like a great model of this, right? We used to tell just the class, and now we tell the whole school so I think we need to understand, like, how do we do that? Because I have 3 kids, they're in different schools, so if you notify my kid's grade versus their cohort. So I think these are kind of the common questions.
Yeah.
We bring them up only because they're the common questions parents come to us. So really clear communication protocols on what means what and what doesn't mean what.
Right.
And parents have to get comfortable with that and make their decisions would be helpful.
That was my thinking. My concern about telling a class is that if one student goes home because they're not feeling well, that student will be obvious to any child who's in that class, especially if now that entire class has to stay home for 2 weeks. So the privacy issue is really bigger with this, and I like it, the lice comparison is very true. At a school, but we send a whole notice out to an entire school saying there's been lice in the school, and then people are calling and saying, what class? I want to know what grade. They want more specific information. So on the level of things that are worrisome, I think the COVID part, it seems to be a little bit, it's more infectious. Lice isn't really infectious, so the scale of it is a little bit bigger, and I could see why a parent would want to know, is it in my grade? And I think that's what we have to figure out, maybe as a group, is who needs to know, or is it,
Mr. Burke.
I think as we think through all of these issues with the idea of providing as normal school environment as we can for our children, we really have to communicate with our parents and have them understand the enormous responsibility that they are going to have in sending their children into our schools. Responsibility for their children and responsibility for all the other children present. And when I think of weighing the information and the benefit of knowing the condition of the various children who are coming into the school, versus privacy. I mean, maybe this is a Mooney question, but maybe we need to reanalyze some of these privacy rules in this COVID environment. lice is, I guess you could argue that there are negative connotations if you have lice.
Right.
But you know what? If you have COVID, there is nothing negative about it. It's something that happens because you are alive in this world at this time. But as we're figuring out these plans and processes, I think we really have to address very clearly these privacy issues, because if it's a reduction of privacy that's going to lead to better health in the classroom, then we need to figure out how to balance those two issues.
Right.
And we can't have a school, close a school because we're protecting
So
a single child's
let me be
privacy.
clear on why I brought up lice, and I didn't mean to stretch an analogy
Yeah,
too
no.
far. I brought it up in this sense. I have 3 kids. Last year they were in 3 different schools. If one of my children presents with COVID, and I tell, say, the high school, what does that mean for my child in middle school and elementary as well? And that's what I think parents need guidelines around, so the school can, and that's why I was doing lice. It used to be like, oh, we only tell a discrete group of people because we don't want to
Right.
create mayhem. But now we tell all people because of the highly infection rate. So all I'm talking about, and it's really picking up of Jill's communication, I think my earlier communication comments for, these are gonna it's almost like we're gonna need a frequently asked questions sheet. Right? So that operationally, you guys aren't inundated every single day with, I heard a rumor that there was a kid who traveled to Florida and they had a cough. Are you clearing all the schools? Right? Like I'm pushing that analogy, and I guess in line with what you're saying, Mr. Burke, so that we know who to notify, and
Right.
parents can expect what types of notification and what they might not be able to expect.
Right.
And
Well,
that's
and
just
the
the
sibling
choice.
question is interesting because if you have a student in an elementary school and they have a sibling in the middle school and the high school, those siblings will be asked to stay home because they're considered direct contact. And then depending on if they show symptoms, then that might change their cohort. So it has a whole domino effect.
Yes.
And it gets complicated. I will say there were several families that traveled to Italy in February, and at that time, the
You're looking at one.
My partner.
at
Self-identifying.
that time when people came back, they hadn't closed. They hadn't been recommending that people stayed home like they did for people who came back from China. So people who came back from Italy got caught in the middle, and then those families, I received several calls from people whose families, their children were being really kind of targeted in the schools. We know you went to Italy, we know you have COVID, and it became like they were kind of being bullied around it. So I get the privacy piece, but I also get the fact that some people will not treat those individuals if they have COVID with like, oh, that really is an awful, terrible thing, we're so sorry, are you okay? It will be more like, you were around my child and now you've exposed us to this
So I think
horrible
what the
thing.
administration's hearing from the board is we value kind of, and that's really
Yeah.
what I had in the
It's-
back of
it's
mind, the
tough.
social, emotional well-being of kids. If we say we value that, if we have clear protocols,
Yeah.
kids won't get caught in that quagmire.
Right.
Because that's not fair to the kid whose parents saying, I took you here, I want you to go to school, and you're healthy. So
Yeah.
just, it looks like what we're asking for is very clear
Yeah.
communication to parents. Same as, oh, sorry, I gotta turn my, Duke, and then Dennis, and I'll come back to you, Debbie.
So, tracking communication, is there anything you need systemically to track all this? In terms of
BLMPs.
kids go out, kids come back in, kids are out for 14 days, they come back. I mean, I'm not asking for an answer, I'm just saying if something else needs to be added to the list of what you all need, technology-wise or systemically, to do all this and have all, and track the data and feel good about it, and it might be something in coordination with the town health department, but just let us know.
I appreciate that. I think that hopefully the plan is that a lot of the kind of everyday Band-Aid visits and things like that to the health office will be taken care of in their cohort, in their classroom. Emergency situations aside, but minor, very minor things. Some things that
Ice packs.
that you would be surprised that people send kids to the nurse for, and I won't go into all those things, but those kinds of things will be eliminated hopefully from the nurse's office, and that will allow the nurses more time to do some of this tracking and keeping keeping a list and using our computer program Snap that we use, we can track and do things in there. So hopefully, but I may have to come back to you if that's not working.
Dennis, I'm going to make you wait 1 second because Deb's been waiting.
So I'm kind of going to go on a different track, but maybe I'll piggyback on something. Is, do our buses have cameras on them? Because I think this idea of assigning kids to seats and not having them move becomes very tricky, and how do you trace that? And as well as my question is, because we don't have a depot for our bus, how are we going to clean the bus? Is that going to be done at the drop-off school? Are we going to have someone walking through at the high school? And then I'm just curious, I mean, and that's going to take a lot of time, and have we thought all through that? And
We've thought through some of it. Do you want to give an update just of the cleaning and stuff in between that we're doing?
So there'll be, so first student has a protocol of special disinfectant that is expected to last a month, that all buses will have applied to it. On top of that, a daily disinfectant, and then because our buses are tiered, so the first runs are the high school and middle school, and then those buses go out and pick up the elementary kids. Once a tier is done, the driver will actually do some spot cleaning with really like bleach and water on a lot of the touch points, which will delay the buses a little bit getting to the schools, as will ensuring that students wear masks. So they'll be cleaning in between the tiers, but more of like a deep cleaning at the beginning and the end of the day of all the buses.
Mrs. Ritchie.
I have my original questions, but now I have some follow-up on this. So as these kids come on the bus, who's regulating, monitoring whether they're wearing masks, ensuring that they keep their masks on? And I think we do have, you had asked about cameras. I believe the buses do have cameras on them. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my first question is, who will be monitoring the children on the bus? Anyone?
So there'll be masks on each bus. So if a child forgets their mask, they can be handed out. The driver is expected to instruct the children that they have to wear masks. They can make the choice of either not, proceeding with the bus if the child doesn't have the mask on. But at that point, there are no monitors on the bus to stop if the child, let's say, pulls it down off their face mid-run and the driver's still running and doesn't see him in that seat. That really becomes an issue of whether or not it wants to be a disciplinary issue.
So that's a discussion of like, well, first of all, finding people who are going to come like for that 1 hour, so on, would be difficult. But that aside, we decided to go down like an educational route. Now you may say kindergartners can't do, well, I think you front load this with the parents again in terms of practicing with their students. That's why we're doing a wee orientation and so on and so forth the first week to make sure that kids can at least understand the expectations. But at this point, there's nobody on there to proctor that or monitor that, and we're trying to deal with it from an educational point of view.
Can I ask my other question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Because I want to go back to Alicia. So when a child comes to your office, are the potential COVID patients going to be separated out from potential allergic reaction kids, or is there going to be a segregated?
Yes, there's a separate isolation room that'll be designated in each school, and that's why we're adding some staff to be able to staff that room should somebody need to be in there with a student for a longer period of time. So they will be separated. If a teacher is sending a student down that they're concerned that they have COVID symptoms, we will ask them to call us first so that we can meet them at the isolation room, and they won't be entering the nurse's office initially. That way we'll go right to the isolation room with that student, assess them, and then determine whether or not they have symptoms of COVID and if they need to be excluded from school.
Okay.
Mrs. Stein.
Oh, I saw it more.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. It was just more a hope that as we formulate these plans going forward, that parents and the community are really clear. If a child comes in and presents with COVID, but we're not sure if they're positive, this is what's going to happen. And then if they are positive, this is what's going to happen. So there's a really clear, basically, line. This is going to happen going forward, these if-then scenarios. So the community is clear that if this child is negative for COVID, are we still isolating that cohort? Have they been isolated, or was it necessary to isolate them? So my hope is that we can have very clear procedures as this transpires.
Yeah, we're working on all that.
Mrs. Stein.
So along the communication, Alan, what are you thinking in terms of, do you see there being sort of one point person for the district that's, that parents call? Because I imagine there are going to be a lot of phone calls coming in, and are we going to streamline it? Is it going to be, are you thinking one person per school or one person for the district to field? There's going to be a million questions from parents of kids who may or may not be positive, kids in cohorts who are removed. I just imagine needing somebody. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, by definition, that somebody is that person right there.
But you're also going to be dealing with like the live situations as they're unfolding. I guess my question is, do we need somebody who is just the administrative person fielding the
That's a fair perspective. That's worth pondering. But officially, though, I have to have a person appointed, and Alicia has stepped to the plate to be that person. But there could be other administrative ways around that. It's a wee bit like the suggestion yesterday to have some sort of hub on our website or otherwise that people can go to, and so on and so forth. So that's probably an extension of that we can consider. Good idea.
Mr. Burke.
First, thank you for all your work. It's enormously difficult intellectual and scientific exercise, so especially in predicting behavior. But just so I understand, if someone appears symptomatic in school and then they're isolated and then they're asked to leave, you mentioned that we request that the parents have the child tested, but if I understand correctly, we can't mandate them to test or mandate them to share the result of a test if they elect to test their child. Is that correct?
This is true. But they would, if we felt that they were a probable case of COVID based on symptoms, they would be excluded for 14 days. And it would require a physician's note to return to school. So, even if they don't share the results, they're out for that period of time, and then they have to have a note saying that their child is healthy enough to return to school. So that would mean they need to be fever-free, cough-free. Hopefully the doctor has assessed them and decided that they're no longer contagious and a risk to other students. So that would be required to return.
Deb?
So I just want to be clear, so the school can mandate that if they feel a child exhibits enough of the symptoms of COVID, they can prohibit them from returning to school for 14 days?
They would need to return with a physician's note saying they're disease-free or not contagious and not a risk to others.
So
yeah,
I want to roll it up a little bit to board level in terms of, I think these are all helpful, to help push operational decisions, and there are two different paths. One, whatever schedules we're developing, are we making sure that all of our children are meeting their graduation requirements? And we don't have to answer that. We can answer that. And then two, I want to get back to the money. So whatever schedules, Chris, that we are developing, if it's a block schedule 1 through 4, either are we anticipating relief from the state for certain educational requirements, and I'm not picking on any, but and or if there's not going to be relief, are we making sure when we design these schedules that these kids meet the graduation requirements? We don't have kids that are held up because they didn't get their whatever credit.
So at the secondary level, that's where the graduation requirements actually exist, and there won't be a problem accessing those courses. The bigger challenge with access is how we develop the schedules, especially at the elementary level, because as we talk about the need for SEL and all the instruction that we need related to hygiene and mask protocols, that's where we have to make the decisions about strategically where are we going to prioritize. But there's nothing that would be in the way of students making successful progress.
So do we anticipate running all courses at the high school?
Yes, unless whatever the final decision is for the schedule. There might need to be some decisions of kids might not get their first choice elective depending on how things work, but there isn't anything clear that's a removal from the schedule based on any of these scenarios.
But so just to put a finer point on it, what I'm asking for the ether is like art credit, a PE credit or whatever, you might not get ceramics if that was your first choice, but we will offer enough art courses so you can take something and you're graduating.
Yes.
Okay, still on graduation curriculum classes? Okay, so Jill?
So my question is more for elementary, really, or maybe early secondary. How are we handling what we suspect is probably educational loss from a curriculum perspective, or what I suspect is educational loss? That it's unlikely that a kindergartner would have had the exact same experience and might necessarily have the exact same skills at home that they potentially would have gotten in the school. So how are we adjusting? You mentioned pacing and you mentioned curriculum, but what steps are being done? And how are we going to think about education over the next, I would say, is it maybe 2 years?
That's a good question. So part of the plan that you'll see is, the title of that section is Assessment for Learning, which is really showing how we're prioritizing and not assessing in every single area that we would have, but really looking at, I would say especially first grade, because that's the most critical year, kindergarten to first grade, that spring semester of reading development. So where we're putting formal assessments might be a little bit more strategic, and there might not be as many. And that's all intentional in order to honor all of the prioritization of SEL as well. So that's the immediate, and we're creating a pacing guide based on what we're anticipating we need to do. And I think I said this at the end of last year too, and now it's just becoming true. We're not going to be able to address everything in 1 year. We do need to look the 2 years and 3 years out. So you're right on with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Stein and then Mrs. Ritchie?
I had a question around scheduling. One of the things in the state document talks about staggered start times, slow times. Have we looked at, for our secondary level, I think at the middle school they have freeze as well, creating these schedules if we're going to blocks or whatever, of if someone has a free, it's sort of an open campus and they can come second period or leave fourth period, if they have sort of the open ends we had in the spring. And similarly at the middle school, I know it requires some monitoring, but one of the things they talk about is if you limit sort of the bottlenecking of everyone coming at the same time, is that being looked at? And sort of tied to that, have we thought about letting any licensed drivers have access to drive and park at the high school? And do we have the capacity for that to alleviate some transportation? That was a question that many parents have asked me, so I put it forward.
So the high school in particular is looking at that in terms of expanding people's privileges. People come in early, late, in the sense of if they don't have classes, driving privileges, leaving campus for lunch. So that is being actively looked at by the high school, I believe. I'll just say I have a touch of reservation about that a wee bit for safety. So as a high school principal myself in years gone by, and Chris, I'm all for expanding, giving kids choice, and they're going to go to college anyway, but it's just balanced with just safety and where we are right now. But yes, they are thinking about that. They're actually actively talking about that.
Mrs. Ritchie?
That was also my question, trying to just, I guess, think outside of the box, how we're structuring, especially in the high school, how we're structuring that day. And not that I want an open campus, but more flexibility in terms of maybe starting a little bit later for some kids who are driving themselves, so we don't have to worry about transportation, and departing earlier for those same kids that can.
Okay, so I want to go back to the money, and here's why. And I'm not precluding any of your questions. I'm the timetable's running in my head now that I see these numbers, because numbers like this are going to also require RTM approval. So I need to understand what you need and when, and we don't need I don't need an actual dollar amount right now, but if we're to go to the Board of Finance and we're to go to the RTM, that's asking the RTM to convene a special session, that's asking the Board of Finance to convene a special session. I have every faith and belief that they will, but when do you need to purchase? Because I know, like, with our budget process going so long, we've run into a problem with technology. We're not able to source what we need necessarily right away. I imagine things like portable hand washing stations or these plexiglass dividers, if we're saying they're essential, they need to be in place. So what's our purchasing need timeline, like tomorrow, which will be not possible?
That was close. That was yesterday, but that's okay.
Yeah.
For the most part, I would defer to how we get the LPNs and what the market is for that. But for the most part, these are things. Some of these things we need like ASAP because we don't put if we don't put in a request, even if we do, it's going to be close.
So, Rich, then, I have Patrice's conversation in my mind, guys, about running. What does it mean to run a deficit? Where can we transfer, as long as the Board of Finance understands that what they're funding is this, even if we have transferred and the money goes into a different line item? Because now we're kind of playing the chess game to get it done. Like, someone, I guess, put together at some point, and we can talk about it now, or if you want to get back to me, I need like a comprehensive plan.
So the accounts would have to fall into a deficit, and we would flag that on the financial report with a running list of any items that were purchased related to school reopening. Then as the year progresses, if there are, let's say, salary savings or other savings related to contracts, we would recommend transfers to offset those. And then you would have a list of what could not be offset, and that really would be what you'd have to go back for and ask. As Alan mentioned, the lead time on a lot of these items is very long.
Yeah.
So it's not as if we could wait to purchase it. You're going to have to purchase it before you get an appropriation.
Even before a transfer, I'm hearing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Go.
so given our conversation earlier today, I think I need to follow up with Tom, because I would say this board is not willfully and knowingly running a deficit. It is reacting to a pandemic.
I'm sorry to just jump in there, but I'm not comfortable running a deficit, not knowing if we're going to realize cost savings down the line. I want to make sure that we have the funds available to make sure that we purchase these things and we're able to fund our operations. So we might have savings down the road, but I want to make sure we have the funds available now, as soon as possible.
Believe it or not, that's why I've been quieter than I usually am, because I've been running this in my mind, how to do it, again, chicken and egg. So I think what we need to do is get a firm, reasonable number. I will contact the Board of Finance. I will contact the Board of Finance. I will anticipate also contacting the RTM, because just my guess is we'll need to go to both, anticipating some quick moving on this. But we probably need to firm up. They're going to need some explanation, right? Like, we're sitting here doing this for hours today. They're going to need some explanation, so we're going to need to put together a packet quickly.
Is there a component of this too? There was a conversation at one point in time they wanted to direct a lot of the students seeing.
I'm sorry, did you say that again?
At one point, there was conversation about hand sanitizer and stuff like that, using state to do bulk purchasing and stuff like that. Is that?
As of right now, most districts are kind of on their own to purchase. I mean, the state is buying in bulk for state buildings, which also takes away a lot of the ability for municipalities to get things quicker, so the supply chain is
like do it from a work perspective. I think you've got to do it like yesterday. This stuff is just not available.
Correct.
We're trying to get stuff from China, believe it or not. I mean, it's just challenging.
I think that's my question. I was like on the portable hand washing stations. I mean, to me, every school district in the country is going to be looking for these, and I can't imagine that there's a surplus of them. So, do we have a plan B to have a fallback if we can't? Either we can't get them in September, or we can't get them at all.
So I do think that's kind of a supply and demand obvious question. I think what I need from this board, and Dr. Adley, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm processing in real time here. This board needs to realize we're going to be running a deficit as we go out and get this, working with the other town bodies to backfill that deficit. But we have not run a deficit in a very, very long time. And so if people are like, oh, I heard you're running a deficit, it is, what I'm looking at, it is truly COVID related.
All of that is COVID.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, y'all know what I'm saying, right? Like, I think we just need to be very clear on what we're saying, because we need to get these things, to Dennis's point, because if we can't, we need a backup plan. But first we need the administration going out looking for and saying, I have found, document cameras. I imagine we are not the only ones looking for them, right? John, Jill.
Okay. As I understand it, there's a time element, and it's in everybody's best interest that you run a deficit on a number of these items so you can secure the adequate supplies and equipment. I think we as a board can give guidance and say we're comfortable with that. Along the same lines, that chart's got to get filled in and communicated to the other town bodies. If we do run a deficit and we don't get the approval for additional funds, then we as a board are going to have to find other areas to transfer and then potentially cut to not meet that deficit. I'm not projecting that that's going to happen, but that's what small percentage chance that we might be faced with as a board later, longer term. So
I would think sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that would be the process. It's my hope and belief that we will get those extra funds, from the general fund of the town. But again, we got to do this to get the schools open. We as a board have to support those decisions, and we'll deal with the implications as the budget year goes on.
Yeah, I think if we go back to what Patrice said, we have to put the needs of kids first. So this is the needs of kids. I'm going to take the Board of Finance at their word that they were going to support COVID-related expenses. Chairman Zagrodzky expressed the same thing in OPC. I'm just now thinking, because I haven't seen the numbers now, but a deficit, I mean, I don't see anywhere in our budget where we can just transfer this automatically without running a deficit, and we haven't done that in a long time. So I'm making every board member aware, given our conversation this morning, which is an amazing dovetail, that's what we're doing.
Just real quick to something
Sorry.
Rich had mentioned, talking about the Greenwich school. There are situations where schools can have budget deficits. That's not per se illegal. I mean, it's something we can do. It will just be on the come. We try and backfill.
Right, so you get an appropriation, in this case of $102 million. You don't spend all 102 on day one, so you have obviously cash available to spend it, but at some point then it runs out, and so then you'd have to make decisions as to whether or not you get a special appropriation, you make budget reductions or transfers or freeze accounts, things like that.
So this is contemplated where we could have this chicken and egg situation. Or it's not okay.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we haven't been there before.
Yeah.
But it can be done.
Mrs. McCammon.
It was just a reminder that there's also the Board of Finance contingency fund that doesn't have to go through the RTM. It's only $300,000. I don't think it covers this, and I think that the process John and you all have already outlined is fine. But I just wanted the board to remember that
The
that
Board of
doesn't
Finance
require.
contingency fund is more than $300,000. This would empty out almost their full contingency. But yes, they could maybe issue a piece of us to keep us whole throughout that. Duke.
And I would ask Rich, just like the conversation we had about what the Finance Committee does and the great reporting that you do every month, but think through, I think an important part of those Finance Committee meetings will be a page or two as part of your deck as to how this is all tracking. So how are we going to continue to be transparent and have a COVID section of your financial reporting?
Yeah, I have so many questions. Go ahead.
No, we have purchased some COVID stuff already, so we'll probably pull that out too for, because we did purchase some stuff already.
What are your thoughts on hiring the nurses?
My thoughts?
Is that going to be a challenge for you, or?
We are trying to see if we can do LPNs, which I think that due to COVID and a lot of LPNs working in assisted living and nursing homes that may be wanting to get out of there, we might find luck.
So, I'd like, maybe we can reconvene and then get the information out to the board. But I do, the one thing I do see missing on this and is staff. And we have budget control, and we should certainly utilize that before we go back to the Board of Finance, but that's a big number. So anything else on reopening?
Could I just mention,
Yes.
I won't divert, but just so as you hear it, just contextually. Visitors to schools we're going to be controlling visitors to schools. He can talk about athletics if he likes, but I'm likely to say that there's no spectators at games, potentially, right? That might go against the rub of the green a little bit. We also have, just to be, again, just clear, because you know, you're going that we discussed this morning. You have to talk about it, and people are going to talk to you about it. We talk about the desk being 3 feet. There are some desks that are round, right? And we are doing what we, as best we can, should be doing certain things from the state. As of 2 days ago, we participated, or I participated in a webinar with early childhood with Beth By, and in there, the children were allowed to sit at a round desk, taped off with mask and test four places, masks on, plexiglassed off. So there will be some classrooms that will have that. I just want to be clear about that, so that every situation is not perfect, right? But
Can I ask a related question? In the ELP and particularly early elementary classrooms where materials like a play kitchen or costumes or shared books in your level, are we doing away with a lot of shared materials? How are we thinking about that?
actually, we've actually removed a lot of just in the regular classrooms, as you would imagine. I'm sure Shirley's listening and ready to answer that question, because she's between her and ELP, they're working on moving either DLC or ELP materials. What is needed or what's not needed. They may be moving to other areas of the building.
Okay.
So as we kind of leave this conversation from now, I think what the board wants to do, what the board wants is really clear communication to parents in a really unclear situation. So I understand that. But we'd like to support you in your plans. Whether you tape desks or use a kitchen, you guys know better than us in terms of how do kids learn. But as long as we're kept up to breast, the communication's clear, we can support that as we go out into the community, also like we were talking about this morning. So as much as we can kind of be kept up to date where we are, I think what I'm really hearing from the board today is we're going to be asking families, like, also please really understand, as Mr. Burke said, your responsibility is here, because there's going to be a lot of community coming together to get this right? And so we really are going to need all of Darien to do that. So if you communicate expectations, we can help support that, and then the community can help understand that, and we can bring questions forward as they arise.
I want to reiterate to the board, though, in this case, right, that's maybe not what you're, Madam Chairperson, but just shows the board's aware, until we made some decisions about what the modeling is, right, for tables, desks.
Alan, I'm sorry.
Can you talk that we can
sorry.
hear you? Sorry.
Can you just be a little closer?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Best.
Until we made the decision, which was actually pretty recently, on all of these, what's the modeling, what are we going to get, what's the actual spacing and tables and all that sort of stuff. So this actually, first time that the actual monies was drawn up was yesterday, at the end of the day. So I'll just give you that's how quickly things are moving. But yes, absolutely.
To your point, Tara, should we expect to see your plan you're submitting on the 24th prior to your submission, or when will the board see what you're submitting?
So we are planning on having the first draft of that relatively in place, well, by Monday, with trying to finish off all the details that we got to do in it. So, I mean, that's a question. Given what you've heard today, are you comfortable enough going forward with the level of detail? I actually hope you would be. You've heard sort of the kind of how it's shaping up.
I think, well, board members, what do you think? Before I say what I think.
You know, just sort of as we leave this topic, I mean, these are difficult conversations, and we have some great tasks in front of us, but we have 4,700 students, we have 700 or so staff, we have about the most brightest parents and people, generous, who live in this town, and I think this is an enormous opportunity for us to do something very, very well. I think everyone's hearts and minds are in the right place, and I'm very confident that we'll develop a system that's going to be as protective for everybody as possible. But this is a great chance for us to do something better than any other community anywhere, and I expect that we'll do that with the cooperation of everyone in this town.
Mrs. Ritchie.
I agree. I just wanted to add communication is key, and I think I'd love to hear how you're developing that going forward for the community. And I just want to thank you for the social and emotional component being addressed, because I think that's going to be critically important because I don't think we're going to have a traditional model going forward, and we need to make sure that our students and staff are well tended to. So thank you.
I would just add, I think I'm comfortable because everything we've heard is that this is really an operational plan of how you are physically getting the day-to-day to schools open. What I would ask is that there's some very clear definitions in there, as much as we can with the information we have at the time. What does a cohort mean? What does it mean for us, right? Like what procedures are in place to open or close a school as much as we can. And then I think we all probably need to take part in, like, this is a discrete moment in time. In this discrete moment in time, this is the plan. And as that changes, so might the plan. Because I know a lot of people are hungry for answers, all of us included. But I do, I think we all felt very differently maybe this end of May, June. We might feel a little differently now. We might, so come August when schools open, it might look differently. So we need to bring the community along with that. And I think as much as the 9 of us can mention or can message, this is where we are at this moment in time, and we continue to assess and make plans, that'll be important.
Appreciate that. And if any board members have observations or reflections upon today, you can certainly get those to us.
Okay. Anything else on this? Other than a lot of work, and thank you. I know it's taken hours and hours, and as much as we're all tired of Zoom, you guys have been Zooming and getting this done. So thank you all very much.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to just ask one more time. If we can just clarify from a process perspective exactly what we're expecting the next few milestone dates to be. So you have something happening on the 17th and the 24th, is that correct?
The 17th will be essentially submitting something like this, projections to the state. And again, don't hold us to everything in there, but basically it'll be a reflection and it just went up, an extension to what you've seen there. And then the 24th, I have to submit to the state what the plan is.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'll certainly, the first person to get a plan will be my Board of Education.
Okay. And then from just a budgetary perspective, you're going to go ahead with purchases because you need to. Are we planning, we understand the implications as a board, are we planning to call any meetings for transfers or finance, either subcommittees or whole board meetings for that process?
So I think part of that is Rich, Dr. Adley and I have to sit down. We have to understand if there are transfers that they can make, they have the right to. If they're transferring, given that we have pulled back the superintendent's authority,
right,
we now need to meet.
Yeah.
I think at this point, rather than trying to schedule a subcommittee and a full committee, since it needs full committee approval, best to call the full committee together and just bang it out.
Okay.
Excuse the phrase, but like we need to be efficient here. I just saw the numbers, so I think we need to sit down, and once we have that, we can probably schedule, because Rich might say, I can transfer this much, but I need your approval for this much, and I know it's this much at this point, and the rest we can, I don't know until I have that conversation. But I would anticipate at this point the Board of Education getting back together. I imagine some of this is going to be a budget transfer we will need to approve up until the point we get any appropriation from the town. Thank you. Everybody clear? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Manfredonia, who's waited patiently. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks for turning the air conditioning on. Feels much nicer in here. I'm going to give you credit for that. We will move on to our discussion on athletics. Thank you, Mr. Tranberg.
It's nice to have it all of it though, in the background.
We also are trying to keep good on our kind of promised to continue a deep dive. One took place a few years ago. I think the goal of this, and what I would ask from the board today, since we are all here gathered again and we have some new faces on this, is that we settle out any questions we have today, so that when we go into next budget season, we have agreed to whatever we have agreed to, and we don't keep reinventing the wheel each budget season. I think that clearly board members can always ask any questions they might have, but the goal today, I think, should be able to leave with an understanding of this department, leave to understanding of this RC, and come to some common ground. I actually liked John used an email, hanging chads. It's like our hanging chad that's always kind of hanging around, that we clear this out with a mutual understanding so that we enter into the next budget season all on the same footing. Does that sound like a good goal for today with everybody?
Just
Mr.
one addition, if I could. I think from a value, and this
Sorry,
might go
can
into
you-
strategic.
can you- I can't
Sorry,
hear you
this
now.
might go into a strategic planning from a values perspective, big picture.
Yeah.
What do extracurriculars mean to this district? And I say extracurriculars, non-sports or non-athletics and athletics, and then work down from there and talk about equity in those aspects. And because I've asked the questions of my fellow board members as the newbie, I said, what is the actual issue around this? And there hasn't been a clear answer because it's come up in so many different ways. So thank you for
So I think if
scheduling
we
this.
leave here with kind of a common understanding of where we are, I absolutely think it'll bleed into strategic planning, because I don't think anyone would deny that extracurriculars have a certain importance in this district. So today it's athletics. Today we have Mr. Manfredoni here. We received your memo. Do you want to lead off? I would suggest letting Mr. Manfredoni go through his presentation and then having questions. Mr. Brown.
It's sort of a newbie following up on John's point. I mean, you're going through this in the in-depth policies and everything, and as we look at the strategic planning, I'm just wondering, what's the scope of our involvement here? We're supposed to set policies and objectives and outcomes. I don't know what the policy is for some of this stuff. Really seems to be beyond our scope, and we seem to sort of dance around some of these issues in minutia, and so I just wonder, are we about to go into a long meeting that really isn't stuff we should be worried about? It's administration, and we just set the broad overall strategy. So I just would like to level set before we get deep into this.
So I think you might find board members who feel differently on this. I think that's why I'm answering that we are, but every budget season, I think that we enter into some of these questions, and every budget season we end up with other town bodies coming up to us. So I think we have to settle some of this out. I might tip my hand a little bit. I think the board's done a lot of work here. I think some of these questions are actually operational, and we need to just say, these are operational issues. You need to leave them to the but we've said that, and yet we've still been asked for a deep dive. So I think that's why what I'm really asking is, when we leave here today, we are very clear on your exact question, Mr. Brown. What is ours? What is maybe operational? And so we're saying to the administration, if we continue to receive questions, we're looking at you guys for answers, and or you need to go. Or if there's someplace we've missed and or could help, or the administration feels that the board needs to step in, we kind of hash that out today. But when we leave here today, we have settled this out to the best of our ability with the information we have now. That's my goal. Mrs. McKemmon, you look like you have something to say, or you're tired?
Well, no,
Or both.
I think I like your point of kind of leaving here today with some finality. The only, I guess I would just, as I was thinking through what's here, I think what I'd love to walk away from today with is the next steps, which are articulated here. I think there might be one or two we could add, kind of based on Mr. Senior or Mr. Brown's questions. But I think we just want to be clear on a direction for the conversation, so that it doesn't keep being amorphous and eternal.
Yeah, I mean, we might leave here today, at least with clarity, that we want to see X, Y, and Z, or we need to meet. But I would agree, what I don't want to do is at the podium on our all-day budget meeting, have 2 hours on athletics again, and then people be like, we ask this every year, and we say, we feel like we answered every year, and have a mismatch there. I'd like to not do another summer deep dive on athletics unless we really need to. Mrs. Ritchie.
And I'll just add, I think Chris gave a really good summary. Thank you. You provided a ton of information, and I'm sorry, everyone, but the reason you have so much paper now is because of me. But I really do like your 4 points that you bring up at the end. I think definitely the student activity manual is something we need to take a look at and revisit, but I think that's a good starting point, and I appreciate all the hard work. Thank
So
you,
let's
Chris.
hand it over to Chris. I'd run through what you want us to run through, and then we can kind of take it from
Sure.
there. And
So for me, this was, I think it was a positive exercise to be reflective on the policies and procedures that we have as a district as it relates to athletics. We've had a lot of the same conversations here at this table, at the central office level, at the building level, about how we handle certain situations. And so for me, it was a good exercise to kind of pull together all of these policies and procedures and kind of present them under one blanket document. So, I'll give some background about the memo itself, then I'm going to touch upon it if I can. So the memo, kind of was a brainchild of central office administrators and myself, and we discussed, what have been the ongoing issues that we have discussed here in this room over the last few years. And so those are kind of the starting point, the highlights of where this document originated from. And so I'm just going to go through it piece by piece, and then obviously we'll open up the discussion, take any questions that you may have regarding these policies. So first of all, Darien High School, as a public school, runs a very comprehensive, competitive athletic program. I think it's one that's looked upon in the state and probably New England even as a top-notch athletic program. And that's because of the resources that the community and this board has provided to the students that we service. So some of the issues that we have talked about is, we understand that athletics and extracurriculars in general are an extension of the classroom. One of the themes that we have, and I have heard over the last couple of years, is equity, right? Where we need to make sure we're being equitable in how we deliver those resources to our students, whether it's from the board or from outside resources being fundraising. We're confident that we're providing those equities, and we're confident that we're being compliant with Title IX in both our offerings and the offerings of the resources previously mentioned. Let's talk about our coaches. Coaches are required to follow both CIAC and district guidelines and regulations as it pertains to our student athletes, both inside and outside of the athletic season. When there are transgressions and those things happen, we deal with that on a per case basis when we need to. But that's the expectations, obviously, of our coaches, that they're following the guidelines set forth by both the CIAC, which is the governing body of high school athletics, as well as our district policies. One of the reflective pieces that I look back upon is, over the last couple of years, when we have these discussions around the budget and around athletics in this room, what are some of the things that we've done as a result of the discussions? And so I think, though you see in the memo is and with the board's support and approval, we've created and we've also adopted over the last few years the 3-year uniform replacement cycle, which is appreciated, because before that there was no uniform replacement cycle. It was kind of the wild west when it came to uniforms, and the board was supportive in developing that cycle for the betterment of our athletes. There was discussion on why certain sports need the number of coaches they have. Why are certain sports being asked for additional coaches during budget season? And so we sat down, we looked at the various sports that we offer. What is an appropriate ratio of student to coach ratios that would be appropriate for the given sport? And so we sat down, we developed this table that you see here as part of this memo regarding a sport, number of participants versus number of coaches. And I think you'll see that we're pretty much in line with what our own standards are, what our own guidelines are, as well as what some of our area schools are, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I work closely with the captains' parents, specifically as as it relates to fundraising. And so one of the creations that came out of one of these previous discussions was the Captain's Parent Handbook. And as an extension of the athletic department in many ways, captains' parents need to also follow the guidelines and rules and policies of the Board of Education. So we developed this guideline, this handbook, that are given to captains' parents at the beginning of each season, are reviewed with myself, the parents, the coaches, so they have a better understanding of what their role is for the upcoming season. The rentals have also been a topic of conversation in the past. For those sports that the board does assign a fee for, we have developed a table of what parents contribute, what the board contributes, and what the total cost is for those rental sports of boys and girls hockey, sailing, which is a little bit different because we'll get to that in a little bit, sailing, skiing, and squash. I mentioned earlier the survey of the area schools, which was done after the last athletic deep dive a couple of years ago. That chart has been updated. You have a copy of that. And it just it shows the number of participants each of our programs have. I think we have Greenwich and Canaan, Ridgefield, and Staples as part of that comparison sheet. The number of Board of Ed budgeted coaches each of those districts have set forth versus the number of participants, as well as their cut versus no cut policy, as it were, for those sports as well. And again, I think you'll see that we're pretty much in line with some of our neighboring schools. Lastly, we updated most recently the captain selection process. That's used by the athletic program, each of the athletic programs for the captains for selecting next season. Okay. Let's talk about some of the policies that have come up and are mentioned in the memo. First thing we talk about is the cut versus no cut. I think that the athletic department has made a real concerted effort for those sports where it's appropriate and possible to do so, to keep as many freshmen as possible. And the board has supported that by adding additional coaches at certain levels. We appreciate that. For those sports that we simply can't keep everybody, and you'll see it's indicated on that chart, it's either a matter of the sport itself just not being feasible enough to carry that many students, or it could be a space issue in terms of just not having enough opportunities for students to get enough practice time given time or space limitations. The equity of programs, the Board of Ed funding versus the fundraising. In this memo you have here, we do have programs that fundraise. We have programs that ask for an optional parent contribution. We have programs that will ask for both. And you'll see in that chart what those monies go towards, how they support our teams for those nice to have involved in their programs. Again, this has been an effort that we have made in most recent history about having teams before they have their fundraiser, before they have their parental contribution set, that they have the fundraiser first, because I think it makes sense that you have the fundraising first to see what the monies come in, and then offer the parental contribution, both of which need to be approved by the athletic director ahead of time. We've had teams that have gone out and asked for parental contribution, and then had the fundraiser. We're trying to make it so it's the other way around, that the parental contributions come after the fundraiser, so to see what their needs are going to be based on the efforts of the fundraising. Sorry. Talked about Rich has also included in here a copy of what those student activity balances are, including your earmarked money. Coaches in a program. Again, you saw that chart about how many coaches we have assigned to a specific program. We feel our ratios are appropriate given what the needs are of the athletic programs that they offer. Also given the fact of what our neighboring schools are and what they offer as well for those programs. Some of the things that we look at when determining the number of coaches needed for an athletic program include risk of injury, the equipment needs, as well as the number of participants. Transportation has been an issue and been a discussion point in the past. We do provide a school bus for any away athletic field trip. If a coach or a team decides they want to have a coach bus for a longer distance trip, the difference of the cost of the coach bus versus the school bus would come out of that team student activity account. There are days, heavy days, when we don't have enough school buses to service the needs of the athletic program on a given day. The contract with First Student allows us to have 4 buses per day. Oftentimes in a normal spring season, we'll have 3 of those buses assigned to shuttle trips to either Weed Beach or to Cherry Lawn, one of the local golf courses, which leaves us only 1 additional bus for any afternoon trips in the spring season. So in those instances, we need to go out and secure a coach bus. The decision as to who gets a coach bus is made by the athletic department. It's based on number of students traveling, the distance of the traveling that takes place. Obviously in those situations, the student activity count is not charged. The athletic department will pick up the cost if we're ordering a bus because of a lack of school bus on a given day. So, as a result, what's the takeaway from all this kind of self-reflective piece on this kind of this self-evaluation of the athletic department and our policies and procedures?
Thank you.
So you see there's 4 recommendations that I came away with. One was, as Ms. Ritchie alluded to, the review of the student activity manual, which was last updated 5 years ago. Reviewing of the athletic policy on fundraising as it pertains to athletics. Reviewing and updating the coach's handbook, which would have naturally taken place as part of our ongoing process anyway. And then 4th, providing additional opportunities for professional development for our Darien High School coaches. And so, like I said, to start, this is a positive exercise for me to go through what our policies and procedures are, kind of put them in one centralized, located place to review, and to kind of live with this document as we live with it every single day in my world. With that, I'd open up to discussion and questions. I'm sure there are some.
Mrs. Stein.
I have a big question, but first a housekeeping question. On the replacement cycle, the uniform replacement cycle you have in here, we didn't defer the uniforms, right, in our final budget. So you still have those deferred for 21 and 22, like lacrosse, baseball, those shouldn't be deferred.
I thought there's a partial deferral, no?
No, we did not.
No, okay, so then
So
that needs
those
to be...
need to be accelerated, put back where they were.
Well, so...
Unless a coach made a different decision.
So this chart...
We did, because some of them, we did cut some because uniforms weren't used in the spring. So there was we did cut, and then we approved some of them because we
Okay, but
were
they're
saying...
all, they've all been pushed back a year, so some should still.
Okay.
I don't think that's.
Whoop, let's let Chris answer.
Okay.
It's his department.
So the money for those uniforms came out of the 19-20 budget, right? They are going to be used in the
We have it left over.
2021 season, right? So this form, this document needs to indicate that they need to be put into the. So these jerseys need to be put in the 2021 season because that's the year they're going to be used and worn.
Yes.
Yes.
So they do need to be bumped back a year.
Yes.
And then we'll.
How we accounted for them and where they are in the uniform cycle
Right.
are 2 different things.
Thank you.
So this chart speaks to the year that they're first worn, not necessarily the year that the budget.
Okay, thank you. And then my broader question, thank you, this was very helpful. I still think we have an implementation issue, whether it's with the Captain's Parents Manual, the Student Activities Manual. There are still teams where they're not following the fundraising, cash is still being accepted, coaches' gifts are greater than the dollar amounts described. I still think we put these in place, but they're not being followed. So I think we need to figure out a way to make sure everybody's on the same page and has the same information. And I liken it to issues we've had with the student handbook, where it's a sign off on Aspen, and how many parents sign off and don't read it, or kids. We really need people reading this, because they're inconsistently following and applying the rules.
Could I just speak to one issue? So any monies that we collect as a district goes through school cash, right? What doesn't go through school cash, however, is the car washes, right? So many of our teams run and operate car washes, and those, we need to figure out if there's a way to have that happen, but they don't go through school cash, the car washes.
I thought some car washes, after the fall season, you were buying your car wash ticket through school cash online.
Not all, no.
I don't think so.
So maybe that's, Katie, what you're saying. That's like the inconsistency. And my guess is mostly, because it's a lot of volunteer that time goes in here, it's people well-meaning, but you get the notebook and you do what the person did the year before you. And if the person the year before you didn't do it right, it's probably because they did it by the person the year before them. But we need maybe to address what are perceived equity issues when they're really inconsistencies in application.
I actually think maybe what we do is, when we have those athletic, educational things, send the handbooks with that email saying, parents, as a reminder, every year, read it, and maybe we require a parent sign off if your kid is in an extracurricular or a sport. Because I just think people need to read it. A lot of people don't know about it, don't know where it is on the website. Maybe we spoon feed it at the beginning of the school year or a season and say, as a reminder, here you go.
Car washes are tough, just because some people drive up and go to the car wash and pay cash, so you can't really go through. I don't know how you would do a car wash through the
I think pre-sale of tickets was school cash online with some teams, and it might have been there was an allowance for people who drive up.
The pre-sale is different than what Mr. Ritchie is referring to, which is where the...
Mr. Brown, did I see your hand go up?
You did. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, Chris, as I'm looking at this, you touch on equity of programs. And there's some examples in here of, say, SEAC rules or Title IX that is going to prescribe their interpretation of equality or equity. When we say equity, as Darien, the administration, and perhaps I deserve a follow-up what we think that means as a board, what does that mean to you when you use the term equity in this report?
So the term equity means that the needs of the program are being met, either through board goals or through external goals. And so different teams have different needs, but I think equity means that we need to meet the needs of each individual program.
Mrs. McCammon.
So first, Chris, thank you. This is a tremendous amount of work, and I'm really grateful to see charts and the policy and the write-up. It's really nice to have all of that here. Thank you, because all of it, I think seeing it all together helps us think about how expansive and how much is involved in the running of this program. I think one of the things that, and it's been touched on a little bit, but one of the things that underlies our regular conversations about athletics is that this is ultimately discretionary dollars, right? That we're not statutorily required to provide athletics. So I think we end up asking ourselves, what are our values and how do they manifest in the funding and culture of our extracurriculars? So to that end, I think that what I would really like to see coming out of the strategic planning and or portrait of a graduate process is a real vision for extracurriculars as they exist for our students. Because I think part of what we're talking about is why are we paying what we're paying? And related to that is what is it we want to have happen with our kids? What is the culture we want around our athletic program? We've talked about that here. When we provide professional development to our coaches, it's not just how do you run a team, but it's also what kind of team are you running? And what are you trying to create in the athletes that you're shepherding? So I would like to see a fifth line item, which is a touch point between those two planning processes, the portrait of a graduate and the strategic planning, and an explicit discussion of athletics. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen in this manner, but I think we want to be clear about what we're trying to create and why we're paying the dollars we're paying.
So I think you want to broaden that to extracurriculars, right? Not just athletics.
Well, I do want that broadened. Yes, I agree. Yes, but so then yes, I want it broadened to extracurriculars, and then within that, I think that does lead to the question of how do we distribute funding across extracurriculars? So, for example, do we have extracurricular programs that are funded less completely than at some of our athletic programs?
Mr. Burke, then Mr. Brown?
Picking up on my colleague's point, well, that might be an issue that we should be able to look at from the documents today. I mean, clearly there are some teams that receive more dollars than others, and that's because of equity as opposed to equality. If it was equality, every team would get the same thing no matter what their scope or purpose was. So I think that we have expressed the values of the community in the teams that are currently being supported. And if there's something different than that this board wants, then there should be a different proposal. I mean, we've had this discussion for years. Oh, why do hockey parents have to pay so much? Well, we decide every year that that we're not going to pay for rental of facilities. So we make that judgment every year. So I don't know if we want to take up a different question with regard to the funding, but we make those statements, I feel, every year. We evidence our commitment and how we value athletics every single year. So I don't know if there's a different thought of how we want to change that. So I just want to make sure I understand what it is you're looking for.
So one of my questions would be, for example, why is Theater 308 not funded in the same way that athletics is funded? So we tend to think of dollars as following our values, right? And so if we value arts as we value athletics, why do we have a discrepancy there? So that's really the heart of my question. I do agree with you that different activities cost different amounts, and that is okay. That's just part of the process.
So let's just push on Theater 308 not being funded. You want to speak to that?
Is it underfunded?
Like push on it? What do you
Well,
push on?
Theater 308 is funded.
Is it underfunded? Are they lacking
The
in
question
funding?
is it funded maybe at the same level? And I don't know because I don't have it in front of me, but I just don't want out there that Theater 308 is not funded.
So this meeting, right, which you know, took me a wee bit of time to get caught up with it, but Chris isn't obviously, well, I don't know if he is obviously or not, but he's not responsible for extracurriculars, right?
Right.
Who is? Well, ultimately I am, I guess, right?
Right.
But there's no extracurricular person in the district.
Right.
So, or co-curricular person, right? So they're all the advocate, whatever the advisor, teacher or coach advocates and supports. So there's no one really sort of
Right.
I have to oversee everything, I understand that, but so it is a concurrent sort of discussion. It is interesting in terms of, look, I see it as a real sense of pride, a real positive thing. I also tend to think that it is extracurricular in some ways, right? I'd say, but I think it's an integral part of the experience for kids, athletics and extracurriculars. I can't believe that, right? So then, once you start pitching the extracurricular against the athletics, which is fair, but in this case, that's not.
Understood. That's what I was saying.
Yeah,
I would like I'm interrupting. Go ahead.
No, and I didn't deliberately not do extracurricular here. We were focused on athletics, but I know they both go hand in hand, so we got to get there.
So I would just pick up a little bit. I agree that sometimes we get into, and I don't think it's purposeful, we get into pitting athletics versus extracurriculars. They're all extracurriculars. What we're talking about is how we are funding extracurriculars, and are there some that seem to get more funding or not. But I don't think I think sometimes, and I've done it myself, we divide them by language when they really shouldn't. It is, we fund extracurriculars at a good, very supportive level here in this district. We need to look at it that way. Mr. Brown, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Just following up, I mean, we're looking to promote personal excellence, skills, and integrity. I mean, that's the overall, whether it's extracurriculars per se or athletics. I agree with Ms. Stein's point in terms of, it has been the direction of this board to set up controls and set up a transparent method to do the accounting. To Ms. Ritchie's point, we may have some cash control issues and things like that regarding the funding. the bigger question I've always had sitting on this board is that when we look at the equity issue, which is the needs of the teams, if we have, I'm going to do a hypo, apologies to Mr. Burke and Ms. Stein, but if you have an archery team and a badminton team, and the archery team can raise $2 million and the badminton team can raise 20, and we have an open, clear, transparent policy that we've put in place, where's the problem? Why is that inconsistent? Why is that not something we should allow?
I don't think we're saying it is.
Well, there have been questions before. Is it equitable that one team can raise more money, another team can't raise more money? That's a theme I've heard more than once in my short time here, and I'm just wondering why is that a bad thing if we have a clear, transparent process?
Can I jump in, not to kind of answer that specific question, but if a team will raise the money it needs, right? So when we talk about fundraising needs, right? There's a goal, right? What is the money being raised for? So, Mr. Brown, your example, if for some reason the archery team needs $2 million to operate, then they would have to prove that, right? What are the needs of a team? So as when it talks about fundraising, we talk about what the needs are of that team beforehand, before the fundraising event takes place. So we know that they're going to raise dollars for a specific purpose.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Duke.
But to that point, it's a good conversation. I think, in my view, to Dave's point, the checks and balances are in there. They come to you and say, we need 20,000. You say, for what? But that's also, a lot of that stuff is for the nice to haves.
It is.
And I think we have to make sure we distinguish between that. We're supplying what they need to have specific to security, physical well-being, and all that type of stuff. And then over and above that, this fundraising is really on the nice to have, whether it's an extra sweatshirt, a specific jacket for a specific tournament or something like that, correct?
Correct.
So, Mr. Manfred, maybe you can speak to that, because Dave, I have heard the fundraising question come up. I have taken it a little bit differently, and so maybe it's just the way I heard it. Is that I agree with Duke. It's the wants, right? Not the needs. We provide the needs so the team can actually function. So how do you, as an athletic director, and I don't mean you personally, just though, how does the role of an athletic director, is there anything, if someone says, I want to fundraise for X, you would say no to? Like, if they want to fundraise for that and they can enhance the team, is it a given? Or is there, I don't, because what I've heard sometimes is, and I think it's said that way, like they can raise $2 million, I can only do 20, that's not fair. I would tell you, kind of life, right? But the perception sometimes then is with the teams on the field that the archery team is looking great and the badminton team has holes in their rackets. Now, I don't know that that's the reality, but I think that's the perception that gets told. Yeah. So how, when people go to fundraise, what are the limits of like, okay, but these are the school standards on equipment or this or taping or this, and if you want to go above that, is it fine? You can fundraise for it? Or is there kind of like, no, we provide equity. I don't know that this is a great example. I'm not an athletic director.
So so during those meetings, we talk about what are the needs of the team. So there have been some instances where I said, no, we're not going to fundraise for something exotic that wouldn't be appropriate, I think, for a team. But most of the time, our teams and our coaches are coming to us with wants for their teams that are appropriate. And quite honestly, they're appropriate given what our competitors are doing as well. So a lot of times you'll see things that our teams would want that we've already seen some of our neighboring schools have or are currently using as well. So there's an industry standard there that, the sweatshirt some of these things that are wants are being done by other programs as well. And so, not to say that is, it's vetted ahead of time, and they have to prove the want.
But is there, I think, to Tara's point, is there a point at which you're like, all right, guys, we got you the sweatshirts, we got you the tournament jacket, like, enough. You've raised $40,000 and we spent it on specific things. You look good. We're a winning team. Like, let's.
Yep. I think there would be a point where we get to that and say that's it, no more. Which I think is one of the reasons why we need to look at our fundraising current policy and maybe readdress and recalibrate some things.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, and I'll let everyone speak. I mean, kind of an absurd example, and again, this is not my thing, but if we said we wanted to raise money for Maseratis for all of our archery coaches, and, you know, and we didn't care what I mean, there's some level at which, and I'm not saying that I think sometimes we think we have to write everything down. I think what this board needs to know is that, like, there is a professional discretion here that you're like, yes, I do think the kids need decals. It makes them feel good, and the parents are willing to raise money for their decals, and they're willing to go sell tickets for their decals, so good on you because you get decals. Versus, you have state-of-the-art X on your field, and the other guys don't, and suck it up, buttercup. Like, just as long as we know that there is some real professional discretion, because sometimes there's equity, but the perception of inequity is where we get stuck in this turnaround. Does everyone
And we
understand?
get to see those major gifts anyway, so there is board and we have had in the past discussion about certain items.
Yes, we should be
Yes.
seeing all major gifts. I forget who I left off on, so I'm going to go down the line. John, and then, okay, we'll go right down the line.
So what I've heard, in observing this from the outside now the inside, is the issue of equity has been brought up by both the board and those that sit outside the board, interested parties, i.e. public comment, right? What I heard today is that there's a pretty clear definition of equity amongst our administration, and that is we are providing, up into a certain amount, the needs of what each team are. And I say, I put that caveat is because, for instance, ice hockey or sailing, or there's one other, maybe swimming, there's above and beyond cost that the town can't provide because we just don't have those facilities, or that sailing, I guess, is more the travel cost.
The boats.
The boats,
Yeah.
right? So I'm glad to hear that. You know, some people might not agree with the subjectiveness of what the administration measures equity with, but they have a process in place. And this is kind of the first time I've heard it kind of defined as we're providing for the needs of each individual sport, and we're making sure we're meeting a certain standard of every sport. So I'm pretty happy. Now, some people might not be happy with that definition, but that's, you know, that's what our experts in our administration have said. So I'm pretty happy and pleased that we can maybe move beyond that point. And then, you know, as Alan raised, we have a bigger discussion strategically amongst all extracurriculars and where it all fits. But
Yeah, and Katie, I'll let you go next. I think where we really heard this is in, there was a concern over, are we providing safe equipment for all teams? Mm-hmm. And so I think as a board, what we need to hear is, like, are we providing for the needs of children? Do we allow people to bring in, you know, their own equipment if they'd like? This is really where it came up. I feel like it got hot with the board a few years ago, where there were some teams saying, we don't even have the safety equipment we need. I think when we talked about that, we found that really not to be the case. But can you assure this board, all teams have what they need to play, we provide what keeps children safe, and then I think at some point in this conversation, we're probably gonna have to talk about, do we or do we not have a policy about bringing in your own materials?
Yep. So we do. We always have provided what's necessary to participate, and if we find that there's a shortfall, we'll certainly provide that. So we've always provided what is necessary for a student to participate safely on any athletic team here.
Okay, Mrs. Stein.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. Okay. I sent this question in to Tara and Dr. Adley, and it sort of speaks to this idea of equity fundraising. A lot of teams raise a lot of dollars for filming, and it's something that is beneficial to teams. Have we thought about, as a district, buying a system? I know their new system's sort of like what they have in the rink. Live Barn.
The camera, yeah.
So Huddle has cameras that can be placed on our fields and our gyms without someone operating them to film every team all the time. Have we looked into that? And would we consider that? And it would relieve some of the inequity in fundraising for certain teams, because it's a lot of dollars for filming.
It is. So the answer is yes. So a few weeks ago, I met with the folks from Huddle and those coaches that do utilize it. We have purchased through the student activity accounts, you see that what those earmark funds are for volleyball and basketball, to put one of those cameras you mentioned,
In the gym.
Katie, in the gym. Yep, so that's coming, they'll see that sometime in the fall.
And would we do it on the fields?
I could talk to those coaches that utilize the outdoor field to see if they'd be interested in having that, because with this camera, you can film practices, you can film games. The other piece of this is that with the inception of the DAF media, so many of our games are filmed. Some of our coaches feel like they don't need to spend money on that because so many of our games are already being broadcast by DAF anyway.
But the JV freshmen, not always. And I
Right.
think from an equity standpoint and a fiscally sort of responsible standpoint, given the amount of dollars we spend fundraising, I would think those cameras on the fields would be cheaper in the long run and provide more teams the opportunity to watch practice, get games. Like, if you have a varsity kid and you're at work, most likely you can watch a game on DAF, not if you have JV or freshmen.
Right.
So I would like to see us look
And we
into
do
it.
see I hadn't thought about it, but we do see a lot of dollars raised for filming.
A lot. And
Yes,
so,
we do.
Yeah.
It's a nice to have, and it quite honestly, it benefits our students teaching wise, and it benefits them, if they have an interest in playing at the next level.
I
as well.
think it's worth the
Okay, I'm going to continue on down. Was it Mr. Brown next?
I'm fine for that.
No, I just wanted to, following up on this, throw out a quick thank you very much to the DAF, the various booster clubs, and the individual parents who've done all this fundraising over the year. We certainly appreciate it. I know I do as a board member and as a parent, and I don't think we say thank you enough, and we'd like to take the opportunity to do so. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we can clear up this so it continues in a clear and transparent manner.
I have a couple questions, but I'll start with, so cut versus no cut. I feel like we talk about that a lot. And I think a lot of it's driven by facility, space, and that kinds of things. And thank you for this chart. It's very interesting to see what other similar schools are doing. I guess the only one that I thought was a little inconsistent was girls lacrosse. There were a couple schools that did cut, and maybe you could just give us a brief overview of what the administration policy is. I know typically in the past it's been coach-driven and facility-driven, so if you could just give us a quick overview again.
On cut versus no cut?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's dependent on sport. It's dependent on, we do speak to coaches about what they feel is a reasonable amount of students they can carry on a team. And so we take that into consideration when we decide, and some of it is facilities driven in terms of number of kids we can squeeze into a facility as well. Safety certainly is taken into consideration as that. So we look at all those factors when we decide on cut versus no cut. Like I said during my preamble, one of the things that we've made a concerted effort for is at the freshman year, I think, is trying to keep as many freshmen as we can for a lot of our different sports, and we've, I think, been successful in that for a number of teams that we find is appropriate. But those are the factors that we would look at when we're looking at cut versus no cut.
So cut versus no cut was the advent of the board getting into athletics. I've been sitting in this boardroom for 10 years. And the reason it was, by my memory, is that because, and I've been on the record that I think coaches really need to manage their team and decide whether they need to cut for how they can manage. And I feel pretty strongly about that. But the reason why the board started getting into the athletic program was the idea was when you don't cut, there are more budget dollars expended towards your team because you have more people, and therefore, as a budgetary measure, do we need to manage? And who has the choice to be cut, no cut? So again, I think if we can kind of understand that, we can maybe clear out this issue. Like, do all coaches have the choice to cut, no cut, barring a facilities issue? Like, a pool is only so big.
So it's a discussion that I have with coaches about where they're going to cut and what levels they're going to cut at. So I think we've kind of settled the freshman piece. The other consideration we take into is seniors, right? If you had a team, a kid who's been in your program for 3 years, I will advocate that student should stay within your program as a senior, and kind of you own them by their senior year. So it's certainly a conversation that I would have with a coach in terms of who they're going to cut, when they're going to cut, how many they're going to cut. So it's kind of a fluid process, but coaches do have autonomy on their own teams, what they can manage. But I would say it's certainly a conversation that takes place with the athletic department about what that number is going to be.
Because I think sometimes, at least the perception is, well, Deb's team doesn't cut, so there's no money left. My team has to cut. Does that occur or not? Like, I'd rather get rid of some of the myths.
No, that does not occur.
Okay.
So your budget is not predicated on if Deb's going to cut or not.
Okay, so if Deb's like, I haven't cut, and all of a sudden I'm like, you know what, I want to. But
no.
that does require, like, and this is how the board got into athletics, like another coach maybe, more uniforms, more games. So how do you handle that such that you're working within your budget?
So the coach piece, let's talk to that first. We would look at that ratio that we kind of developed in the last year or two and see if we're falling with those guidelines, and if we're not, we would come and ask for a coach. Games is set. It's a number that's set that wouldn't have any indication on whether it's, cut versus no cut. And uniforms, I think, we can manage the number of uniforms given our athletic budget if we need to order a few more uniforms for a particular team, given the confines of what we have within our budget.
So part of what came to this board this year is coaches for teams, and the choice really became, all right, that's fine. If you don't want to put this coach in, we're going to have to cut at the freshman level because we need the correct amount of supervision. I think everyone at this table wants kids safe, right? Like, we're not going to put 75 kids with one coach in a contact sport and pretend that that's safe. So, sorry, I lost the thought. My point being, there is at some point a budgetary factor, right? Like, if we don't give you the coach, you can't do it. So do you have, or does the administration have administrative regulations or beliefs that, like, we believe at the freshman level there should be no cuts and therefore we have staffed teams appropriately? Because if that's kind of the given, we know what we need to put in the budget and we know what is dangerous to cut out of the budget. Or if we cut out of the budget, we need to cut fully out of the budget so we're not selectively applying it.
So I think the answer to your question is yes, we do, given the specific sport. So for example, if we have 30 kids come up for a freshman boys basketball team, we can't carry 30 kids on a freshman boys basketball team. It's just too many kids. It would become, even if we added a coach, there's a space limitation there. You're only allowed to play 5 at a time. So I think in those instances, we would have to unfortunately cut freshmen. So again, I think we've made a concerted effort to keep freshmen as many as we can, given the space and not budgetary, but space limitations that we have for a specific sport.
So again, just so the board would know if they're asked, and I do think this is operational, like, you have a management system in place for each team. There is a maximum level. Like, I can't take I don't know the right number, so I can't take 250 freshman soccer players, right? I can't take 400 freshman football players, and I can't take 1,000 freshman hockey players. I don't think there's JV hockey players. You have that as a manager. Therefore, if people have questions, it shouldn't be the board podium they're coming to. It should really be superintendent, the principal, the athletic director they're going to understand that. Yes?
And those decisions are unique to each sport. So each sport is going to have a different requirement in terms of, I'll take swimming because I know swimming. You can only fit 30 kids in a pool, so you can't have more than 30 kids on a swim team because you can't physically put more than that. So sort of each sport is going to have its own criteria that has to be followed.
And the other thing I'd like, if I just mention, some of these sports, I think if they could carry the number of kids they would, right? And some of these sports that say they cut, they may not have cut the last couple of years because they just have had a need to. But as we see increased numbers in a program, as an example, swimming, if we have a large, indication of a large number of freshmen coming through this year, we may not be able to keep them all because of the space limitation. So again, the cut versus no cut is very fluid. It could change from year to year depending on how many kids we have interested in coming out for a program on a particular year.
Well, and I think there's a little bit of an elephant in the room, and I don't want to pick on any sports team, but really what we hear a lot is like, look, football doesn't cut, boys lacrosse doesn't cut. Yeah. So do you allow for that up until the point, say that, okay, you haven't cut so much that you now require another bus. And because you require another bus, we have to sit down and we have to talk about what the implications are because I have to build an athletic budget. Right? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what we get at the podium each year. And I would argue that swimming is different than lacrosse. You can put more kids on a lacrosse field than you can in a pool. I think what we're looking to hear in order to be able to say to the people at the podium, please go back to the administration, is you have kind of these management processes in place and you have reasons for why you make these decisions and they can come talk to you about them. And to John's point, they can like them or not like them, but that is how you're making the decisions.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Burke.
Right, and I was just going to say it another way, because I think this is how it comes up in the community. So you're the athletic director, and you can assert that the teams that do not cut are not asking for no cuts to improperly inflate their budgets. Lacrosse doesn't say, you know what, no cuts, so we can have more resources, or football, or whatever team it is. So when those teams come in and they say, we don't cut, you do an analysis and you decide, you know what, it's necessary and proper and sustainable that they don't cut, and their motivation is pure, if you will, as opposed to economically driven.
Yeah, I think if you look at those large teams you just mentioned that don't cut, the budget has remained pretty much the same over the last several years. If you look at the history of it, and those numbers have fluctuated. 120, 130, 135, probably somewhere in that range. But it's not people keeping more kids to increase their budget, because their budget is what it is. I think we're able to meet the needs of those programs given what the budget has been set at.
Thank you.
Mrs. McCown.
So, thank you. Fundamentally, again, I really appreciate this report, and I agree with the next steps. I think it sets up a great path forward. I'm glad we're looking at the student activity manual. From what I've heard, it's fantastic, but there's some things that need to be tweaked. I'm thrilled to hear we're looking at the policy on fundraising again as we're talking here. That it sounds like there's some things that we need to capture in policy, and we've heard along the way. I think, again, based on what we've heard, it makes sense to review and update the coach's handbook. And when I say we've heard, I mean through the years. I'm glad to hear there's opportunities for professional development for the coaches. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what exactly that is. But I think, again, just both administrative in terms of management of teams and in terms of a vision from the district. I would like to ask, as a number 5, that the administration look at the possibility of an equipment replacement cycle, if that makes sense for athletics. I don't know if we have enough equipment or if the life cycles are short enough, but so that we don't come up with things like a wrestling mat randomly, so that we're kind of aware of what's in the queue. Not that I think it was random, I'm not saying that, but kind of like we do with technology, and the uniforms, if we could do that for equipment, I would ask you to consider that. The last thing I think that I would ask the administration to be thinking about is to be ready if budgets get tight. So I think we can kind of debate in the abstract, cut, no cut, and it's been helpful to hear some of the theory. We can, I hate to say pay to play, but if budgets get tight over the next couple of years, that we're just have some information in place so we're ready to go with how to have those conversations. And again, that kind of goes back to what are our values and how do we fund them, whether we're flush or whether we're tighter.
If you could include pay to participate analyses on that, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, just thank you. Ready for the thinking if it comes to that. So that's my thought on next steps, and I appreciate it. And then embedded in that was if Chris, you don't mind just clarifying what's inside of the professional development you're planning for coaches this year.
Yeah, so CIAC, actually the State Department of Education mandates that every coach has to have a coaching permit. And as part of that upkeep of the permit, there are courses that have to be taken every 5 years to keep a coaching permit valid. And so I think my plan would include more professional development offerings for our coaches. And there's a broad scope of topics from ethics and morality to care of injury to CIAC rules and regulations. I mean, there's a broad myriad of what those topics would look like. So I think the plan would include, obviously, in having more of those development opportunities, for specifically Darien coaches. I think, with the, in the past, those have taken place in person. And I think kind of one of the good things that came out of our quarantine is that we've found that we can do some things operationally remotely, and so I think that would be able to increase our participation in that.
So Dave and then Deb, I'll let you go, but Jill, because I want to leave here with common understanding, You said we may have some policies to review. What specifically are you talking
Well,
about?
it says specifically here, review of the policy on fundraising.
Okay.
That's number 2.
So, that's coming from the administration. So what would you like us to review?
So I don't know if I'm specifically asking the Board of Ed to review, but it could be an internal review in terms of how we handle fundraising. Are we gonna allow teams to continue with the practice of having a fundraiser as well as asking for a family donation? I think that's something we're looking at closely in terms of numbers of dollars needed to run a program. So I think it was more of an internal processy, but it could be involving the board as well.
So it sounds to me like that's actually not work we need to do. That's an administrative regulation stuff you need to do, and if you need us to act, you'll be coming back to us. I want to be clear on what work we have
Correct.
to do versus what work you have to do.
I think this
So
is
take-
all them.
Well, I know, I just want to make sure, and then also to people watching, when they say, you said you're going to look at your policies, like what we're talking about is
It's
their
an
work.
internal review, I think, and then if need be, we would come back to the board for.
And John, when you're.
Or
look-
give an update on that,
Yeah.
the finality of, or the completion of review. Sorry.
John, when you're looking for an analysis of a pay to participate, what are you looking for?
I'm just saying if we get into a budget crunch, if the administration can consider that in its analysis of cuts versus generating revenue, consider that
So as part of cut,
Yeah,
no
does it
cut,
happen
budget.
in other districts? That sort of thing, just
Okay, sorry, I'm asking everyone to be really clear so we can do it. Dennis?
Yeah, so something that to me always keeps coming up, and I appreciate Mr. Sini saying it's equitable, but I still think I struggle with the rental fees. So we always hear about swimming and a agreement with the YMCA, and I look through this rental comparison, and I struggle with, Board of Ed pays 30% for girls hockey, 25% for boys hockey, 18% for skiing, and 65% for squash. And we also don't include the turf field that we replaced on a baseball field 2 years ago at, I think, $650,000 or $700,000. Maybe that's capital and not operating, but to me, I think this is part of this question of equity, and how do we determine that we pay $700,000 for a baseball field and we don't charge anything to baseball or field hockey, you play on that field, but we're charging $33,000 for girls hockey. So to me, I have a question, how do we answer that question?
So we've had a couple answers throughout the years, including what's an FCX sport and what's not. Or SEAC, sorry. But Chris, do you, and also I think, just one of the answers, I'm not saying it's the answer we need to sit with, is that there were traditional agreements when these sports came into the district, and we've stuck with those. It might not be sufficient for what the board wants to do now, but that's the state of the world now.
It is. So that's been a long-standing agreement, and I guess if the board wanted to take that up, we could discuss it. But the charging of those rental sports has been a tradition here in the district for quite. It predates me. I don't know if I have the opinion to whether I wouldn't be for pay for play for all sports, but if that's something that this board wants to look at and analyze, we can certainly do that. We did just replace the turf baseball field. We did replace the stadium field, I think, not too long before that, as well as the center oval field. And so we've never looked at all those costs in one big pot before, and that's certainly a different way of looking at it. I know it's come up before.
So I think Dennis raises a good point. This comes up regularly, so if board members have feelings, now is a great time to put them out on the table. Like, well, Mr. Brown, Mrs. Ritchie, and then Mr. Sini's jumping out of his seat. Okay, Dave would like to skip.
Well, I have a bunch of questions,
So I think John was maybe right on this issue, right?
Okay.
Or no?
I'm sorry?
Were you right on this facility
I
issue?
have something on that too, but
Okay.
you can go ahead.
I'm
Go
up.
ahead, John.
You're up.
Sorry, good. No, I think there's certain expectations of what a school provides, and in certain are found commonplace throughout the United States. I don't know. A pool might be one of them that the town has not delivered, but an ice hockey rink is often not found. So I think, there's some subjectivity around that. I don't mean to be biased, but you also look at the cross utilization as a community, as a school community. The baseball field is not just a baseball field. The stadium field is not just a football field, and the center oval is not just a soccer field. So that, you ask for input from board members, that would be my kind of separation, how I would justify the capital expense around fields versus other.
We're maintaining what we have. We're maintaining the facilities that we have control over, so we don't have control over an ice hockey rink, but we have fields that need to be maintained. And I looked through this chart, which is the money collected, and it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, and just to clarify, sailing, skiing, rugby, are those SEAC sports? And who governs those sports if they're not governed by SEAC?
Yep.
And then just looking at, I'm sorry, I have so many questions, I've been very patient. And just looking at this chart, it looks like some of those the parents actually are able to raise the money through fundraising to pay for some of the needs that they have. And I can just fire questions at you if you want, but
why don't you let them answer?
Yeah, so you can answer those
Let's
first.
go with the facilities ones now.
Okay.
To Dennis's point and to.
And just to address the SEAC issue, if the sport is not a SEAC sport, who governs that sport?
Yeah, so most of those sports, the non-CIC sports, does have a governing body that oversees it. Rugby you mentioned, sailing you mentioned, girls hockey has a which is not a CIC, it's FCX sponsored, but it's not CIC sponsored. So there's a Connecticut Girls Hockey State Association as well. So those other sports that are not CIAC sponsored do have governing bodies that oversee them.
Mrs. Stein.
So just in response, Dennis, and I think I've said it before, but as a parent of hockey players, hockey as a youth sport is probably one of the most expensive sports relative to other sports. And I do think, trying to pay for all the ice time, all that, I think for parents relative to what we pay as youth hockey parents, it's, I don't hear a lot of complaints as a parent of hockey players on both teams about the money. I do know that where people need it, we help out, but relative to, say, playing soccer or field sport, it's just you don't have the expense of playing hockey. It's very different.
Mr. Brown, and then I'll come back to you.
Still going back, but just a quick follow-up as a hockey parent, there's no such thing as free hockey, so this you kind of know this going in.
It's so
No, and I totally understand that. I think where I struggle, and I've heard people struggle, is that it's if you're going to pay, then shouldn't it be somewhat similar expenses, whether it's dollar amount or percentage amount?
Wait, what do you meaning that all sports should be we should pay 50% of squash, swimming, and hockey?
Exactly.
Got it. Okay,
That's all.
sorry.
That's where I think that's the question here. Is you're paying
percentage should be the
65% of squash at $21,000, and you're only paying 30% of hockey at $30,000.
Dennis, one quick thing on that apples to oranges is I think that some of those sports have different amounts of times.
Yeah.
Different hours of actual participation, so that may need to be reconciled to get a true picture.
And that's fine, but I think if we don't codify this, then 2, 3, 4, X number of years later, another 9-member people are going to be questioning this again because, we go back to these are traditional agreements. I mean, boys hockey has been a sport since the 60s, so it's been a traditional agreement for 50 years. So I've never seen a document of this agreement. Nor I think has anyone here.
So I go back a little bit to Jill's initial statement about, actually, sorry, wasn't your initial statement, but I'm borrowing a little bit from it. Here's what we're doing up here. We're using taxpayer dollars. And what we're doing is we are educating the children in our public schools with taxpayer dollars. So we're hitting and we hear this, right? We hit reading, writing, arithmetic. Then we decided that there's more than that, and we've added more. Then we decided there's even more to that, right? 10 years ago, people weren't talking about a social emotional curriculum. Now we really realize the value of that. We pay for that. At some point, Darien embraced a very robust extracurricular program. I don't think we will get support from taxpayers to say, You want a sailing team because you live on the water? I'm going to buy all your sailboats. You want a hockey team? I'm going to buy you an ice rink. You want a pool? I'm going to build you a pool, which is deeded that we can't build a pool, so it's not happening. At that site. Maybe Deb can find a way elsewhere. But I do think part of this, we can stay in the theory of like, it would be nice, but then we have to get down to the practical of the use of taxpayer dollars and how we are using them. And my feeling on this is that it is not equal. If it is equitable with the people we made the agreements with, if they were coming to us and saying, we have a real issue paying for X, Y, and Z, then I think we need to understand what the issue is. But at the moment, with taxpayer dollars, we can't create the issue.
Well, that goes to Chris, if he's had feedback.
Yeah, Chris,
on
if
those
you're...
teams, that it's too much. I mean,
I haven't had much feedback on the rentals and the amount that they pay. We do get scholarship requests, and we have a process that we follow, and we do get those requests, and so we are able to assist when we can.
But to Dave's point, ice time might be different than pool time, which might be different from squash time. And I don't know squash, so I'm going to pick on it, but any squash parent out there, please don't pick on me. You don't want to see me play. But I have no idea what the going rate of a squash court is. And maybe part of the reason they pay so much is because it's so expensive and the district only has this piece of the pie left.
You pay $14,000 for squash, and you pay $8,000 for girls hockey, and $7,000 for boys hockey. So why are we paying double the amount for the squash team than for the boys hockey?
Well, because I don't know, maybe the ice time is more. What I'm saying is when squash came into the district a few years ago, right?
Before my time, it was in place when I started, and I've been here 7 years now. So.
Yeah, and they've actually changed facilities and done the whole thing.
Yep.
That was the deal they were able to make with the district. That's the slice of the pie that the district had with taxpayer monies to fund them. When hockey made their agreement, it's there. And if hockey would like to renegotiate and come to the table, I'm not urging all the hockey parents on, but then they should come to the table and do that. I don't know that as a board with taxpayer dollars, especially in this environment, we can start saying...
No, but I think there's one thing. I think this is to Denny's point. Maybe we take, and maybe we, when I say we look at the dollars that we've allocated towards esports, and maybe we could shuffle it around. In other words, if you're saying you want to see more equitable distribution in terms of percentage, we take the dollar amounts that we've already allocated to these rental sports and maybe allocate them differently. I think that's what I hear you saying. Yep. Yeah. In that way, it's not impacting your budget or our budget, and yet we're still...
Well, it's an accounting mechanism,
yeah,
right? But the same thing is the dollars expended are the same.
But then some sports will pay more and some will pay less, and then, anyway, okay. I'll let you guys figure that out. I have another.
It's an immaterial difference to the taxpayer.
Can I talk about something else? Maybe
Well,
this is...
okay, wait, you can talk about something else. Does everyone, and Dennis, I know you're not satisfied on facilities, but next budget season, does everyone either know where we stand? I mean, is there what's left that we want to do on facilities? Because it does come up every year, to your credit, and you've been a staunch advocate for it. But I don't want next budget season to reinvent the wheel on this one. No one? Everyone's
Dave,
where they are? Dave.
Just a quick follow-up from a little earlier as we're we had talked about re-looking at some of the policies, but that's properly administration's work, I guess. I just had a broad question. In terms of some of the controls and things that are in here, Rich, and this may not be a question for now, do you have any input? Are you satisfied with this structure, or is it something perhaps you may want to revisit? And then the other question I had very quickly is, are there any athletic monies or extracurricular monies of any type that are outside our budget that we don't have visibility into?
So in terms of the first question, I think School Cash Online is a very good system. The student activities manual is very good. I think one of the things that should be looked at is, so the policy is to sweep accounts and then put it into a general student activity account. What should be the policy of actually withdrawing money from the general student activity account? Because if the goal is to not have high balances in whether it's the athletic account or the high school or middle school, and you're just sweeping the money over, if you don't have a good policy on how to withdraw that money, you've kind of just moved the problem to one account and just kind of left it there. So primarily it's scholarships, but what else besides scholarships is an appropriate use for that general student activity account. In terms of the control, obviously the less cash you can have, the better. So the more parents use school cash online when they can pay online, the better. But as Chris mentioned, things like car washes where somebody might just drive up and have a little bit of cash, those are always the type of things you want to try to avoid as best you can.
Should some of these maybe be set a little bit higher, given these have been around for a while?
In terms of the
dollar limits, is that something we should perhaps, I don't know, just throw that?
I think some of them are driven by the IRS.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right, Katie, when we wrote this?
Well, it's the auditor, well,
I don't know, I'm
These
just
are
throwing that
audited.
out. Probably not for an answer now, I'm just wondering, some of these numbers seem low,
So,
and maybe come from statute.
I would
And
like
again,
to talk
is there
about this.
anything off budget we don't see in our normal big book we get every year? It's all captured. My question was, in our big budget book we get every year, are there any monies for the athletic or other extracurricular activities that we do not have visibility into?
So there are funds that obviously hit the student activity account, and we don't, within the actual budget book, there is not a student activity section. So what we included here for athletics was like the bank balances. So those are the funds outside of the general operating budget, all held within school cash online.
okay.
Would there be a thought to include that going forward into some of the budget items for transparency purposes?
So those aren't taxpayer dollars? I mean, the people giving them happen
No,
to be
but
taxpayers, but
they're
not
part of our
part of
audit,
our-
so it's part of our audit, and we have this, so, I'm
We
sorry.
got the annual thing of gifts and fundraising, right?
But that doesn't include everything, so we have these activity accounts that, so just correct me if I'm wrong, at the end of, you gave us this slide, or this Excel spreadsheet, and some of them still have balances that exceed $1,000, so can you
So we,
tell me?
as a matter of practice, we just won't sweep accounts probably till the middle or end of August.
Okay.
In terms of the workflow, typically the first thing we have to do is close the operating budget, then we have state reports to do with hard deadlines. So the next practice would be to sweep accounts when available, and that's probably going to happen at the end of middle of end of August. And that would be looking at, so if we were to look at the athletic accounts, where you have like, $800 in field hockey, things like that, the $1,100 in ice hockey, sweeping anything over that $1,000 threshold will probably happen in that time.
So what happens when that money gets swept out of that account? Do they no longer have access to those funds, or can
So-
they?
It's in the general.
So it's
So
in
it
the
gets-
general fund, but those teams that raise that money, that have lost those funds? Is that
So it gets
essentially-
swept, practice has been to sweep that money into a general student activity account. The primary purpose is for scholarships, so in the case of sports, somebody might have a scholarship request for ice hockey. If that gets approved, then funds can be withdrawn from that and then put in, let's say, the ice hockey account. Though there are more funds within that general student activity account than scholarship requests.
So we've never seen these before.
This is great.
So this is great. So
This is great.
little backup is that the idea was, and Chris, correct me, and Katie, because this was a few years ago, when you raise your money, you raise it for that school year. And the auditors came back and said, when your accounts are starting to run high balances, that's not a good accounting mechanism. Sweep it, you can't like carry over. So sweep it into a general account, and then as people need it, they can apply for it and they can use it. Totally with you on policies around this general account. That'd make me very happy. So we've actually never, as a board, seen these accounts. These are fundraised monies in an account. I'm a
So
little.
I think this one,
Yep.
just a clarifying point, they'll get swept, leaving $1,000 in there as startup money
Yes.
for next year.
The idea
Right,
was to
yeah.
give the team the next year
So
a
I
little
think-
bit of a leg to
Right.
work on.
Except there are some teams that have earmarked funds for certain purchases, for instance, sailing, so that money would not get swept?
So you might have some teams here who have a zero because they've used all their money, right? Or they have a question. I'm looking at like football. They have a great fundraising program. They supply their team. They just did a fundraiser, but they seem like they're at a zero.
Yep.
So you spent it all.
The purpose of the student activity account is you have credits, which is your money coming in. If you're raising money for a specific purpose, you should have that corresponding debit, which is the expense for
Okay.
whatever you raised. So if you see something with either a zero balance or a very minimal balance, it's meant that they collected that money and then they've correspondingly spent that
Spent
money.
it,
as well.
okay, that's great. So I think this is really useful. I would say I'm a little concerned putting it in the budget, because I think on the budget, we're going to the town for our appropriation, and these are all nice to haves, they're not wants to have. We don't really have control over this, and unless we make a policy that somehow the board now has access to student activity accounts.
I guess it's a transparency question. Is this something we think we should have, or is this something we should have and provide to the town, or is this something that really just belongs to the athletic program? That's my question. May not be in the budget book per se, but
Yeah.
like, should we put this out once a year, or
Well, maybe it's nice to have a mid-year snapshot of the accounts.
Twice a year?
Well,
I don't know.
I'd say a mid and a summer, maybe just to know where it goes, but I don't think that this is part of what we colloquially call the budget, which is our itemized estimate for our appropriation.
I agree with that.
I think a view into it in line with when you give us the overview of all the donations.
Yes.
I think that goes hand in hand with a financial picture of donations and fundraising.
I'm sorry, saw a couple hands. John, and was it Katie or Joe?
So one of the things that came up during the budget revision discussions is our practices around the general student activity account. You made a couple comments that made my eyebrow rise. One, we probably couldn't spend enough money out of that account. And then two, we do things differently accounting-wise than any other district than you've seen. So I'm not sure, this might go off topic beyond athletics, but athletics are part of that. So I don't know.
No, these accounts are athletics. I'm comfortable with you
But
going.
the general account, so I guess, one, we don't see what the balance is of the general account, do we?
We have not issued a report. I mean, we certainly
So that's like, to the transparency issue, hearing that it's probably got a decent sum of money in it, that'd be probably a good thing to see. And then two, we don't have to solve it today, but maybe when you guys have some time, extra time, talk about what accounting practice you think is more common than the one we have. And if I remember correctly, it was taking all the revenues from any of the activities, throwing them in the activities accounts, and then paying the associated expenses through different accounts. So
like gate receipts would be a good example. That was one that was raised during the budget.
yeah. So I would really love to discuss that at some point, because it sounds like we got an account running a pretty large balance.
So part of the history of that large balance, I think, is that teams held large balances for a number of years, and when we put the sweep in, all of a sudden that account jumped up. But those had been the purviews of teams. And Chris, I think this is where it comes into like the fundraising review. Part of the question is, well, why were teams continually fundraising and building up these big balances? Because when we swept, I don't know, those of you who are here, if you remember the outcry of captains' parents of like, I raised this money for this team, why are you sweeping my account? And the accountants were like, accounting practices, you better sweep. And so that dichotomy has now led us to maybe a larger balance. But going forward, we shouldn't see, because you should really only be approving fundraising on an annual basis.
I think that might have been the initial outcry, but I think captains' parents have gotten used to the fact that the money that they're raising is going to go towards this year's team, and that understanding has, we get very little to no pushback on that at all. That the money that you're raising is for this calendar or school year.
So part of my concern has been using the general fund as like an offset, is that it is only going to be big for so long, because we won't see an ongoing. We shouldn't see, if we're only approving fundraising for annual needs, we shouldn't see ongoing funding of that.
The funnel is still going in with gate receipts, though. There's still a positive inflow from gate receipts, right?
Yeah, although
And not associated takeout of the associated things.
not this year. But gate receipts also are used to offset other things as well. That you're supposed to make.
Typically, in most districts, gate receipts are shown as a revenue line item in athletics. And it does fluctuate whether you have a turkey bowl in district or not. So usually one year you'll see it very high if you have a turkey bowl, and then you'll see it very low. But you'd have corresponding offsets with, like, whether it's police coverage, so you'd gross up your expenditures that way, but you would show your revenue. So it's very clear in terms of what you collected. And typically, the majority of what you collect for gate receipts typically is football, but it might be basketball and some other sports.
And those gate receipts are supposed to be paying those currently too.
I'm sorry?
Those gate receipts are supposed to be paying those currently as well.
They're not though, right?
That has not been the historical practice.
So we gotta, that's something.
So that's part of going through the student activities manual,
that's
which
what I wanna
Mrs.
confirm.
Stein worked very hard on.
I'm just, so we need to revisit, this is what I'm trying to get to. So Rich, in your view, this document needs to be revised and updated.
So I think it is a very good document. I think it.
Sorry, Katie, don't take offense.
This is not personal.
But it was 2015, I mean.
Yeah, it's been 5
any good
years.
Policy, it needs to be reviewed.
But a review would be appropriate, and like I mentioned, clearly outlining what a good purpose would be for that general student activity account would be a good addition to that manual.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what I've been trying.
Mr. Morone.
Yep. Another thing, Chris, thank you for all the work. I think it's really spectacular, and I think it's really great to try to see some things we've never seen and we've always talked around. And one of the things as well is this amount collected per team at the beginning of the year, because to me, that's always something else we've heard is parents like, I go to the parents' meeting and all I have to do is write a check. And you look through this and most teams are fairly equitable of $100, $125. Some are none. But to Mr. Brown's point, if they can raise that money by fundraising, why should you have to pay $100 per parent? So I think to me, this alleviates a lot of this equity of how much do you have to pay at a parents' meeting, and it's fairly consistent.
Well, I'm appreciative that we're going to start with fundraising, and then if fundraising doesn't meet the need, then there'll be the request for a parent contribution. I think it's a good process.
So that does create interesting opportunities for fall sports or hurdles for fall sports. Because if
It
the
does.
team can't do team activities prior to the beginning of preseason, technically, even though it creates hurdles. So I just think we need to talk that
Yeah,
one
it's
through.
not a perfect system.
Yeah.
But we were running into a couple years ago, these collections, these optional family fees at the beginning of the season, then the end of September car wash will come, and oh, by the way, there's another $4,000 or $5,000. Now you've got this large sum of money that you've got to spend by, usually the end of your season, your banquets, when pretty much everything kind of winds down. It's just another way of looking at it, and we're trying to have people think in those scenarios, versus asking for a big check up front and then having your car wash, whatever your fundraising endeavor is going to be. So maybe that first initial ask is less, given the fact you're going to have the car wash. This will be a unique year, though, because the car wash that we do have tentatively scheduled may or may not happen. I mean, so it's a bit of a unique year.
There's stressful children around car
Right.
washes.
So if we get into this situation where teams can't take some of the traditional activities they previously would we deck that from the general activities account? Would that be the first step, or we go to parents first?
I mean, there could be certainly a request if it shows a need. That would have to go through, the finance director's office.
Okay, so
I have no idea, I'm just asking.
Yeah.
what I want to do is make sure we hit all of the issues. I feel like we typically hear cut, no cut. It sounds like at least if going into next year, which is going to be a crazy sports year, we kind of know where we are. Facilities feels like we might know where we are. I think the other thing we hear a lot, especially from RTM Education, this has been their question for a long time, is coaches, can you explain, I think we've explained at this table a lot, that like labor laws, coaches' ability to coach off season, I think there's a lot of perceptions around that, but also maybe if we can publicly have out the legalities of that so they understand maybe why the board doesn't, if I get one more phone call, I know this person is coaching this and I have to explain labor laws, I'm going to scream.
So our coaches can coach out of season. There are limits to what they can coach in terms of working with our student athletes that they're made aware of ahead of time, that are CIAC policy. But many of our coaches in our district and other districts as well do coach out of season. They're entitled to do so, and they can coach some of our kids on a limited basis as long as they're meeting the regulations of the CIAC. They're permitted to do so. I will say the CIAC has opened that up a little bit this summer, given the fact that we lost the spring season, and coaches have been made aware of what those recent changes have been. But coaches can coach out of season with just restrictions on what they can and can't do when it comes to our student athletes.
So often, I know about other board members, but I get the question of like, well, why don't you have a policy that your coaches can't coach your kids? That's like an unfair labor practice that we actually could not enforce legally.
I mean, I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I don't know if you can, if as a board we could or you could determine if a coach can or can't make a salary outside of
And we have had that, I think, with our attorney a couple times, but
Just one quick follow-up. Who sets the threshold of how many student athletes can participate in that, it's called private team?
Yeah, CIAC sets it differs by sport, and is actually they've kind of relaxed those rules a bit, for the spring season. I'm sorry, for the spring coaches because they lost the season. Yeah. That's a kind of one-off, but the CIAC sets those limitations.
Mr. Burke.
And Chris, I haven't looked at this in a while, but when you talk about coaches coaching their athletes out of season, are they permitted to coach them individually as opposed into a team setting? Like if I want to give, my basketball player private instruction and charge, I think that's different than saying, all right, I'm coaching a summer league team and you're all paying whatever you're paying.
The CIC really the rules around outside coaching are talk to the team setting as well as camps and clinics, large team, settings.
So if a coach was coaching a player privately, that would be something that we would frown upon, right?
If they had remaining eligibility left, that would be something, that'd be an issue.
I think it's a ratio thing, Chris, if I'm correct with
It
CIC.
is. It's ratio.
You can have a certain number of your players in ratio to other players. So
it actually
I think it's 5, right?
It depends on the sport. It depends on the sport, and it's also, ironically, if you have to work for an outside organization, you have to be, make a certain amount of money. There's specific rules the CIC has about when you can and can't do in the off season.
Mr. Brown.
Just following up on that, if it's a CIAC policy in terms of what the hours are by sport, do they monitor compliance with that?
No, they don't.
Do we monitor?
We
compliance?
monitor, and when we're found to be in violation, we self-report.
Any other questions? Mrs. McCammon.
One of the things that this whole question is often compared to is teachers and why teachers can't tutor students. Is there a reason, Marge, in terms of, I presumably it's because they're a different class of staff, but is there any more intelligence that we could add to that?
I do think on a special meeting that's going to be pushed off topic, teacher tutoring policy, other than to say we have a tutoring policy. I'm happy to answer the question and we can put it even on the next agenda for an update, but I do think if we get into teacher relations, we might get in trouble on a special meeting.
That's fair.
But yes, the comparison is also
So ask it a different way. How come we can't govern coaches like we do teachers?
Well, the coaches are governed by CIAC there,
Okay.
and the teachers, we would need to bargain the impact of not allowing them to tutor because it would be affecting their life.
It's a good way to get it in. I don't mean to cut off the answer. I just don't want to get a ding on like a special meeting.
Can we go off topic for one? It's athletics, but what's your thought on COVID and sports?
So I actually, I'm surprised we didn't start with that, quite honestly. So,
Are we allowed to ask that or not?
It's a discussion of athletics, so we can, but I want to wrap up this review first, and then we can do it, because it goes to reopening and athletics. So in terms of money, I think the other thing the board also hears, actually in terms of all of this, often I think what the board hears is, well, you don't know this is going on, right? Which is kind of hard. If we don't know, how would we know? Can you maybe explain, kind of for the board and the public listening, when you hear of a concern, I don't believe this this followed this rule or this coach followed this rule, can you explain to us a general kind of process to kind of help the public? Like, if you have a concern, there is a process by which this concern will run.
So an investigation would take place regarding whatever the allegation would be. I'd work with, in many instances, Marge or building administration, determine what did or didn't take place, and if we are found to be in violation, we self-report. we discipline coaches when needed. So there is an investigative process that would take place when these allegations do come forward.
Okay, any questions there? Because I do think that comes up a lot. I mean, we hear a lot of like, well, they got money, but they didn't give it to you. And what I will say is it's really hard for a board, like, that's an interesting thought, but like, what would you like the board to do? We actually are not an investigative body. We can ask our administration and or we can tell people the right chain of command for an investigation, but we're not an investigative body. Mr. Burke.
Related to that question, I've heard people say, oh, well, you know what, the coaches aren't reviewed, they don't have their preseason meetings with the departments or however that is set up, not just new coaches, but coaches, current coaches, or do those meetings, do those in-person reviews, et cetera, take place?
Yes, so I meet with coaches seasonally before the start of each season to review, policies, procedures, guidelines of the district, of CIAC. We talk specifically about what their season, specifically for the fall season. We also they get reviewed at the end of each season as well. There's a process that takes place at the end of each season as well. So there's a front end and a back end piece that take place when it comes to coaches.
Sorry, lost child needs a ride. I'm just trying to clear out all the things we generally hear. I think the other common theme we get is, or maybe people don't realize, coaches are reviewed and evaluated, right? And so we do get a lot of it. Well, what about this coach? Or I don't like the way the coach. Can you talk a little bit about the coach evaluation process, and or if people have concerns, where they go rather than the phone call?
Yeah, so the coaches get evaluated on the interpersonal skills, their duties as a coach in terms of sports-specific skills, their attentiveness to CIAC rules, Board of Ed rules, their interaction with the media, interaction with the students, care of equipment, communications with myself, communication with the athletic department in general, care of facilities. So there's a number of criteria that I review coaches with at the end of each season. I'm sorry, you had a second follow-up question about...
Well, or if people have comments or questions,
yes.
kind of where to go. Because I will tell you, sometimes we get them and I send them to you, but...
And I get a lot of them as well, which is fine. It's part of the process, part of the job. We encourage parents and students to go to a coach first, and if it's an issue that involves, let's say, playing time or the role in the team, I think that's more specific to a coach and more appropriate at that level. Certainly, if there's no, outcome that's desired at that level, then I would certainly get involved. I've had parents who just have come to me with overall concerns, and we investigate thoroughly and weed through the issues. So, again, if it's an issue of playing time, role in the team, we hope the student would talk to the coach first, if not the parent, and if need be, I certainly would get involved and have gotten involved. But I also have parents that will come to me on occasions to discuss concerns they may have within the athletic department in general. We talk through that as well.
I appreciate all of your preparation, Christopher. And this year, the discussions have been around, a lot have been around consistency, where this sort of started with. From my side of the desk, that's kind of what tends to arise. So that has been helpful to get some things on the table. The policies around student funds and so on and so forth, there's some recommendations to do that. It would be helpful around like Dennis's issue. That's a good example, right? If we don't come to some agreement on, maybe it's like for the next 3 years or whatever, or we can live with this percentage or something, or it's reviewed on a certain timetable, we're going to get the same thing again. There'll be continual discussion about it. It'd be nice at some point to go, look, we did have that discussion last year, and we decided to move forward with this model. Now, it doesn't mean to say that a good idea doesn't trump something, but that would be helpful to know, as you've checked off a couple of things to do here, if there's anything else we need to come agreement on, so that it sort of...
No, I agree. I would like, if anyone has issues, now is the time. Elsewise, I think we need to come to agreement, or say, no, I'm not in agreement and I need more information right now, because we need to know where we are and can't keep doing the same over and over again.
Just a small follow-up to Dennis's point, if we are going to do that, would love to know if, say, we had 10,000 hours on squash courts and 10 hours on hockey, and that explains part of it. Would like to have some sort of metrics there to understand a little bit more depth other than just a gross number, please. Thank you.
So the facilities issue is still something y'all want to investigate?
Just looking
Thought
at your
it- yeah.
list, you had storage.
I'm not, if we're just going around the room, I'm not troubled by the facilities issue at this point. I don't think it's prevalent enough to merit more work or investigation, but that's just my view.
Mrs. McCammon, how do you feel on this issue? I'm going to go down the line, so I know we've either cleared it, we want more information on it, we want to hold now for 2 years on it. I think
For the moment, I think the next steps that are outlined here, plus the ones that I added, I'm comfortable with.
Mrs. Stein,
Me too. I feel
Mr.
like
Sini.
Yeah, the one thing we didn't talk about was storage related to athletics.
I want to just close out the
Oh, sorry.
facilities issue,
Well-
and then we can come back to anything left outstanding.
Okay.
So where do you feel on facilities, paying for facilities? Are you fine on percentages? Do you want to see
Sorry.
changes to percentages?
I think if parents aren't, to me, if he's not getting complaints about
Yep,
it,
yep.
to your point, they exist. It's been in place for years and years. If there aren't complaints, why are we tinkering with it? That's my thing.
Yeah, if it's not broken, don't.
John's with Katie. That's what I'm taking.
We
Dennis,
know where Dennis is.
respectfully.
Sorry, I just think we should look at try to make it so it's understandable so you don't go through this in 10 years again.
Duke?
I'm okay with it.
Deb?
I'm fine unless we're starting to hear parents are unhappy with the way it's structured, then we can revisit it. But right now I'm fine with what we have.
Okay. I'm comfortable where it is. I'm still stuck, and I think we're going to have some really tough economic times. I think when we do, we're going to be looking at extracurriculars holistically and trying to figure out how to tighten them up overall, not expand expenses surrounding them. So at the moment, while imperfect, I'm not looking to expand our expenses.
I'm not saying to expand, I'm saying to make it equitable. And to me, to Mr. Brown's point, I think he makes a great point. We should check the hours and the rate, but I would be in favor of reducing squash from 65% to 30%. That to me is, and then everything is around 30%. But to me, that's an outlier at 65%, unless, to Mr. Brown's point, is that the hours make it different ratio because you can only put 2 players on a squash court at once. So.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I mean, I just heard Dr. Adley say we should have something, we looked at it every couple of years and we're comfortable. So if we're doing right now, everybody's comfortable, and that's fine by me, but I would think that, to do this analysis properly, we would need a little bit more data. But it seems the consensus is we're fine, and I'm not going to object to that.
Yeah, I mean, my thing is I think when we pick 30, that's arbitrary as well. I think at this point, we are going to be looking at tightening budgets going forward. And so
Just to be clear, I'm not advocating for expanding the athletic budget at all.
No. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think not last budget season, the one prior, there was an idea on the table. Let's make them all 50% to be equitable. I think last time we had this, we agreed on traditional models, but it came up the next budget season 6 months later. So I just think we need to know where we are in space. So in 6 months, now it might be we reserve the right to review this every 5 years, every 2 years. Or if there's a great idea, bring it up. But what I don't want to do is 6 months from now be like, I want everything at 30%. I want everything, like, we have to know where we are in space. Duke?
So Dennis, are you looking, just to be clear on what,
I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to be clear on what Dennis is saying. Are you saying that you would be looking for the percentage that the Board of Ed pays for squash to be reduced?
I'm just saying that we have a rationale to pay, why we pay what we pay, so that we, in 3 years, if this gets brought up again, you can say, this is the rationale. And to me, the rationale of, we had an agreement 50 years ago is not a rationale.
Yeah, no, you've been very clear. I think, no.
Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm in a minority on this, so that's fine too, but to me, I just don't understand how
Chris
that's.
wasn't able to answer the question, right, because this predated you. So you could do a bit of research and understand why there's a different squash rate of reimbursement versus hockey, right? That's kind of what you're looking at.
Yeah, I think to the
An
point
explanation.
of, we should agree as a board when we want to review it, but like we've put in a uniform cycle, a uniform replacement cycle, as long as, Chris, if you can come and say, like, on an annual basis, you look at the hockey agreement, the skiing agreement, the squash agreement, and the sailing agreement, and I think a couple of times we said, well, that's what's been in place. Well, that's what was negotiated years ago. Well, that's what we've had in place. That's not the right answer. The right answer is you review it, or the administration reviews it on an annual basis. You're comfortable with it. We assess the feedback we get from parents, and we're comfortable with the overall fee structure. Then I'm fine with it, and then we review it, whether it's annually or every 2 years. But we need to stay away from that's what's been in place, or that's what was done 10 years ago. That's not right either. That's not the answer.
So my concern is, unless we come to an agreement now on where we are for at least this next year, if there's a line of people at the podium, we're going to rehash all the time we spent today. So what I need to understand is, Chris, what's your knowledge base on why we pay these fees? And then is the board comfortable? And so if there is a line, short of something material that would change that, we say to the public, we have had this discussion, we understand where we are, this is where we are, and we budgeted based on that understanding.
So the issues that I see is that, the percentages are inconsistent, right? And the reason they're inconsistent is because, to Duke's point, these are the dollar amounts that have been allocated to these sports for X amount of years, which is not a valid argument, but is the argument, right? So I think a fairer, more equitable solution to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if we take the allocated dollar amounts we have for these rental sports, squash, sailing, hockey, sailing aside, sailing should be, I think, kept this simple, and reallocate those funds so that the percentages are more equitable across the board. I think I would, correct me if I'm wrong, address your issue of equitableness.
I think so, but I don't want to have the squash parents up in arms.
No,
but
at the same time, be budget conscious that we're not adding lots of money to the budget to bring those numbers.
So how do you do that? So let's just say you bring everyone to 30%. I'm just going to use your example. There's a corresponding expense or an accounting change.
I wouldn't bring everyone to. I would. The percentage would come after the fact. I think you look at the pool of money you have to spend that the board has allocated to these funds, right? You look at what the anticipated rental costs are going to be for these sports, right? You subtract, and then the difference, I think, is be divided up amongst the teams that are left, the teams that are
the
spending
dollar amount's
rental
the
money.
same, and then it's divided evenly among the teams.
Maybe I'm not explaining myself right.
To Mr. Brown's point, though, it can be
assessing
done.
parents differently in the coming budget year.
Correct.
But I think
the numbers would
for
change.
me, I just
then.
think a little bit of analysis would go a long way in this. And I don't think we have I think Dave makes a great point. If we break it down by hours, break it down by the number of people using the facility, then you can begin to have some metrics to have an informed decision. Right now, we just have a dollar amount and a percentage. And I don't think there's enough to make a decision, and I think it's going to just keep bubbling up every few years. It's really.
So I think that was the point of today, if we needed that, and we can do this again, right, if we need to, but that's what I'm trying to suss out from the board. What answers do you need? What answers are you satisfied with? So we are not doing this every weekend. Mr. Brown.
So to follow up, I would like to say I'm comfortable. I don't want to reopen the budget and reallocate it among sports at this time. I think if we did get to the point, the general activity fund may be a way to mitigate that in the budget, but I don't think there's any interest in doing that. I agree with Dennis, we should have some more information in front of us, and maybe that prompts a further discussion, but as a person who seems to have kicked off this latest round of questioning, I'm comfortable moving forward for the next year with everything in place as it is.
I second that.
It's good. I'm leaving it to you guys because I need a little direction here. Mrs. McCammon.
I think what's been said makes good sense. I think this is something that should be reviewed on a regular basis, and as part of that review, if we find that with some a little more analysis, the numbers are not as they should be, then that opportunity is there. But you set up a longer time frame for parents, then I don't think we need to make any changes going into this budget right now, anyway. But I do think it's something we need to be collecting more information on and assessing over time. And so I think as long as we set up an infrastructure, I hear your point, Dennis, and I think you're right, and we need to be looking at it, we need to understand it. Whether we decide we want to create a framework that says, you know, this is how we assess based on these criteria. If you don't have a facility, we're going to assess you X%, or whether it's just straight up, this is what it costs, and therefore you have to pay. That can be articulated at the administrative level, you know, that you just have to pay because we only cover something. Then we probably can set up the precedent for that. But
So I think what I'm hearing is that everyone is comfortable going into this budget season. When would you like the next type of review on this? Because what sometimes happens is all of a sudden it's like, well, in January we asked for a review of this again. And what I want to do is be able to set reasonable expectations. If we're going to say we're going to give the administration a year to study facilities and we don't want to see this until the following year, then we all know where we stand this budget season. If we want to say 5 years, we know where we stand.
Well, what does Alan think?
Yeah.
I'm happy I'm happy, I mean, I'm in a basically good wee place right now, but I just don't want the distraction, right? Because there's just too much time on it, and there's too much noise on it, and yet it's a great, I mean, we all take a great lot of pride in it. I just,
So how about this as a suggestion? We know where we are for this budget season. We're going to ask the administration to take the next year to look at facilities, to understand where we are financially, and come up with a recommendation at our retreat next summer. It won't have to be an athletics deep dive per se, but on this particular issue, because I think this one, but we know where we are for the next coming budget year, and next summer we will look for information going into the following budget year. That gives us both a year to study, a metric to kind of say to the administration, we're looking for a recommendation, and in the meantime, to Jill's point, if people ask, the explanation of where we are is really an administrative explanation at this point. Everybody comfortable with that?
I'm comfortable on that. I just want to clarify, is that just on this one particular point, or is it on the 4 points that Chris raised and the 1 point Ms. McCammon raised, that's a year to come?
So Chris, you need to tell us what our timeline is on the 5 points you've raised.
4 points.
4. Jill's is 5.
I hadn't thought about that. I think it's realistic that these could be put in place by the end of next school year. That seems like a realistic timeline to the board. So I guess, you know, this time, or maybe a little bit before this time next year, June of 21.
Okay, so we're going to add the facilities to that as well. It'll all be next year. We'll look for a report out on that. And Jill, in terms of what you want, given that's work product, the board needs to vote on that to authorize the administration to do that work. So, Jill, do you want to make a motion?
And remind me what that word is.
I had asked the administration to consider whether or not an equipment replacement cycle was valuable. I'd like there to be one. I just don't know how much equipment there is. So, you know, I don't know if that's work per se today, but
I think to
So
authorize them to be ready for a deadline, we should just agree to the work if it's what we want to see today. So, Alan, what do you think on that?
if you're talking about equipment replacement cycle, I mean, honestly, sorry, Chris, I just see that as part of a budget process. It's fairly straightforward. I mean, that's not like a year's work. Well, it might sound like a year's work, but you know, I just think it should be part of an annual budget. But I don't want to put something in there that's going to get people focused on athletics 100% again for the whole budget. But
So I think what Jill's looking for is like another spreadsheet, right? Like we have uniforms. I think what I've heard from the administration in the past is that we do have an equipment replacement cycle, and it's in the budget every year in what we do. Jill's looking to maybe drill down on it a little more. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jill.
something that matches the uniform replacement cycle, the technology replacement cycle, just to put that level of discipline around the sports equipment.
Is that something like uniforms where like a baseball mitt has a life, like you replace it every 3 years?
I mean,
or
there's
do you do
so. I mean,
equipment
think
on
about
a-
just think about the offerings that we have in our sports and all the equipment that is required for hockey and football. I mean, some of it is yearly replacement, some of it is, there's a lot of equipment that is needed to run an athletic department. The uniforms are easy. I'd have to think more about how that would look, equipment replacement cycle, because there's just so much equipment that goes into an athletic.
Or it might not be that all of
Yeah.
it's appropriate. So my ask is for the administration to think about it, not necessarily.
Okay. It feels like that should be your wheelhouse in your department, that you should know what your equipment is. If it bubbles up to the board that for some reason we're hearing we didn't get equipment, we would probably have some questions for you, but it feels a little granular for us. So I like the way Jill has put it, in the sense that like what we're asking is that you have full eyes on that and that we can stay out of that.
I think some of it goes back to, I don't necessarily want to take the time at the board level in a budget process to talk about replacing a wrestling mat that we've used for 25 years. My thought is, that's your business, that's your area of expertise, and that should just come through the normal cycle of what you need dollars for to keep things up to date. And I think that's kind of what I want to understand that, and I don't want to get into the weeds in this, but you're here a year, you spend time with Chris. If you're comfortable that we've got the right process in place to replace equipment, that's the comfort level I want.
Okay, so in order to do Dennis's work as well, I need a motion. And then what the board will do is let the administration know that we will look to see a report in June of 2021 or the summer of 2021. I don't know that we want to get specific months. Sometimes months hang us up. So I do need a motion to request from the board the work for a review of facilities rental and expense fees by the summer of 2021. Dennis so moves. A second. Katie, all in favor? That is unanimous. Okay. Because when we order work, we have to order it as a board.
We didn't do Jill's.
Because what Jill has said, I think, Jill, what you're not actually ordering work today, you're asking the administration, and I think we can take a sense of the board that we all agree. I mean, if anyone disagrees with that, please let me know that that's a reasonable and wise thing to do. Anyone object to that? Okay, so I think the administration hears us loud and clear on that, right?
I do.
Okay, so because we were having a discussion on athletics, and it is also an update, I think Mrs. Stein had a question. I'm sorry, is there anything left outstanding?
Yeah, we didn't talk about storage, just related to athletics. So one of the items that has come up is, we have all these temporary storage units out there. Some are youth sports oriented, some are high school oriented, right?
Or district, yeah.
The district. We also have youth sports utilizing some storage space underneath the home stands of the stadium.
We do.
So I guess where should that kind of as a resource? We're spending money to store things in a temporary unit while a private organization is using our storage space. So kind of where does this fall in this whole fairness and policy and
Probably politics.
that's why this is where we should be involved.
So for those who don't know, John's alluding to, again, predating me, I guess DJFL had stored their equipment in the 2 Renshaw Road building, right? And when that building was repurposed and central office moved here, the then superintendent allocated space for DJFL because they were getting evicted from the Renshaw Road space at the newly built high school. And so they have a storage facility on our property under the bleachers as you enter or come onto the stadium. If you're walking back in the building on the left-hand side there. And so what John's alluding to was the DJFL for, again, predating me, has kept their equipment, pads, helmets, in that space on our property.
I mean, you're all looking at me. I've been on the record on this one. I've been on the record a couple times on this one. I think that we have an inconsistent policy. We are not charging some groups, and we charge like DYLAX, and we charge other people. Like, I think
Yeah.
we want to be partners with these organizations. I think we want to work with them, but I think we need consistency on this one, especially when we have a need.
Consistency, yeah.
So it's free of charge. They're storing their equipment.
Yes, I think,
Yeah,
I
and
think
it-
at one point they were asked to move out and they moved back
They-
in. I'm not.
They,
really-
so when they did the lights a few years ago, they needed access to that facility, and so they had to move their stuff out and then moved it back in. So they got a temporary box.
I'll speak freely because I was a former board member, and listen, I love that organization, but the fact that we're renting storage units for high school sports and they're in a permanent facility just doesn't make any sense to me. I do think we should allow access of storage on school property for these, other or outside organizations because it makes sense. But this is something that I don't know if it's not a board issue, is it?
Oh, wait a second. So we are paying, the district is paying to take stuff
No,
off?
so the issue is this,
clarify.
the district pays for storage boxes, right? We rent those
We're
big
renting,
storage
okay.
boxes because we're out of space. DJFL is in some of our storage space. There have been ongoing negotiations at different times to please vacate that space so that we can put our own space in, and if they would like to rent the storage bins, we'll make them available to them, but why are we paying to store our own stuff when they're under there? I am directly in line with Mr. Sini on this one. I think they're a great organization, but we don't extend, it seems silly that the district should be picking up costs.
And in the age of COVID, we also have some issues around locker room space and other
Yeah.
things that, I think this is a prime time to kind of relook at that and, again, make anything available that we have available. We don't have availability of permanent storage space, and we should be repurposing that towards the schools, and the private organizations should be looking for temporary space or elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I agree.
Agree.
Mr. Brown.
I want to take advantage of your institutional knowledge. We had a program going. We were going to look at different storage facilities on the high school property and walk around. That was an agenda item we had. Whether we had, what happened to that? Did that go away, or we still have that on the
We'll
agenda?
look to the facilities committee.
Yes,
Deprioritized.
it was deprioritized.
Yeah.
So does that properly belong in athletics, or should we reprioritize it to have this conversation?
I think that's a little bit of a different conversation.
Okay.
Maybe during board goals and objectives, it might fit into a higher board goal and objective. I do think in terms of kind of immediate needs for storage, that conversation should, at least Mr. Sini and I feel that conversation should recommence with DJFL, in the best spirit, but like, we're out of space and we need it, and you have it, and it's school property.
I'd be happy to work the political angle on that.
Be happy to let you.
Make that first, make that first phone call.
Mrs. McCavin.
Well, I think the political angle is the right way to handle this in the short term. In the long term, do we have a clearly articulated either board policy or administrative procedure around allocation of our property and storage on it? It seems like a good time to make sure that that's clearly delineated in some sort of form, whether it's board policy or administrative procedure.
I would argue high level we do.
Sorry?
I would argue high level we do.
Yeah, so we look at the rental, I can't remember off the top of my head what the rental policy is, and use of facilities.
Thank you.
I can't remember what the use of facilities and rental policy is, but that's what we would look at.
Thank you.
Look, I'd say this. Anytime we've approached DJFL, I have found them very reasonable to talk to. I don't know why this issue continues to linger, so if there's a good way to facilitate the conversation, it's been going on for at least 3 years.
Yeah, I don't think it's been contentious by any means. I
No,
just
that's
don't
what I
think
mean,
we've
like-
focused on it as
It
a
hasn't,
district. We haven't kind of solved it. And
Yeah.
It's incumbent on us overseeing that, the town-owned property, if you will, district-controlled property to manage it.
I think probably the right is like, Chris or the superintendent to explain the need, and we need use of our place.
I've always gotten along with the youth groups, including DJFL. I'd be happy to make that phone call to their president and say, explain the situation. I'm sure they'd understand.
Yeah, because I think as Dennis and the facilities committee and do on this work, and this was part of it, you need an audit of the space you have, what's
Sure.
available, how's it being utilized, and we have someone else within our space, so we just We just need the space now, where it might have worked very easily before, it no longer works.
It will probably result in another box being put on our property.
Or
Yep.
the use of our box.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
Flipping
I mean, honestly, those boxes are really facility. There's not much athletic. The tracks, we have some track stuff in there.
We have some.
And I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, swap it out.
So we probably do need to be clear on our policy on our side, in terms of if it's okay with us just to throw it in another box, or they actually need to rent one. I think we probably need to be clear on the administrative side, how we want that to go down.
Yeah, I don't think it's okay just to throw it in the box. I think we charge others, and so we have to apply policy consistently. It's probably the best way to do it. Anything else overall on athletics?
Did we talk about
Nope.
yours?
Not yet. Mr. Burke?
Status of the reopening.
Yep, I'm just saying,
that's-
generally
yeah,
athletics,
yeah.
and then we'll go to this year, which I think will be a very unique year.
Yeah.
So Mr. Manfredonia, an update
Yes. So
on this year.
I'm looking for my notes. Excuse me. So we meet weekly. We being statewide ADs with members of the CIAC. We had every Thursday morning. So we had one this morning. And so right now, for the focus is the fall season. So I know there's questions about the winter and the spring, more so winter at this point. But the fall is really about the focus of the CIAC and its work right now. And so they're coming up with 3 possible calendar scenarios for the upcoming fall season. There's a subcommittee that's doing this work, and will make recommendations to the CIAC Board of Control probably within the next couple of weeks. The 3 calendar situations are, first is the standard schedule that you see now on the CIAC website, which is start on the 17th for football, 27th for all the other fall sports, and ending, with our state championships probably, mid-November to mid-December for football. Option 2 is if we start on time but end early by mid-November for all of our sports, including football. And the third option is to start late, end early. If you look around what's going on in the country with some of the NCAA sports programming, you see that they've moved to either conference schedules, or the Ivy League has postponed their fall season. I think the Patriot League followed suit not soon after. So, if I were a betting man, and I have no inside intel, I would say that it's likely that our season could start late and end early. When end early, they want to end it, hopefully by mid-November. What that would mean is that we would have to compact our schedules as they are certainly constructed now. It could mean that we have some kind of a regionalized schedule. We're not playing a full slate of games in a particular sport. We're playing, reduced number of games against competition that's in our area, probably Lower Fairfield County. For us, it would mean, Greenwich, New Canaan, the Stanford schools, and Norwalk schools to reduce travel. You saw recently New Jersey, I think, was interesting, postpone their fall season by a few weeks. So they're starting, I think, early October at this point. The good news is that Connecticut is in great shape in terms of our COVID numbers. I think that will help us in the long run. I think the CIAC is committed to having some kind of a meaningful season for our fall athletes, but it's going to look different. And it's going to need we need to have flexibility. They're looking at the possibility of sub-varsity freshman JV schedules taking place on the weekends because of issues of transportation. We talked about in this room about what's going to need to take place in between bus runs and sanitation of buses. And so we're anticipating having less buses available to athletics during the course of a week. And so what that means, we would possibly be running jamborees on the weekends. Like everyone comes to a Darien High School for a soccer jamboree or a field hockey jamboree or a volleyball jamboree, given the specific sports. We've talked about at the state level open tournaments. So if you're not playing a full slate of games, how do you determine who qualifies for tournament, who doesn't? So they're talking about having everyone qualify, playing some kind of open tournament format. If you win, you move on. If you lose, you play in a loser bracket just to give kids more opportunity to play. I think the goal here is to give the fall athletes some kind of meaningful gameplay, but it's going to look different than it currently does. Will look different than it certainly has in the past.
Any questions? Mrs. Stein?
Do you see any impacts to our district with COVID? Meaning, does it impact size of teams, number of coaches, budgetary impacts? Like, how is it, when you think about it, what, to John's point, locker room, right?
Right.
Because
So-
if we are putting budget numbers together,
Yeah,
that
so-
should be included.
I asked that question this morning on our Zoom meeting about have districts thought about the possibility of reducing roster sizes due to COVID, and not one district answered in the positive that they had thought about that. So I think in terms of roster sizes, the sentiment at this point anyway is that we would maintain our current roster size. I think though things like locker rooms will look different. If we allow students to access locker rooms, we would either, we're talking about staggering times of students allowed into locker rooms, spreading them out, using some unconventional spaces to get changed into. So I think it's going to look different in terms of locker room spaces. Alan mentioned earlier about no fans at games. We're fortunate we have the DAF media to broadcast a lot of our games so parents can get the opportunity to see those contests. So there's lots of moving parts to this and lots of things for us to consider as a district. There'll be recommendations that will be made from this subcommittee of the CIAC, but ultimately it'll be up to us as a district what we want to do in terms of putting in guidelines.
So what does that mean, up to us as a district? Up to the board, up to the administration, up to a collaborative conversation?
It depends what you mean by which part is up to us. What do you mean by which part are you talking about?
I think all of it. Are we going to utilize locker rooms? Are we going, if we are, how? Are we going to allow fans in our stands? If we do, are we going to put limits on that? I assume that if the CIAC is moving forward with some kind of a fall season, that we as Darien High School would participate in that season, and that we would do our due diligence to make sure our coaches are wearing masks and kids on sidelines are being socially distanced. We're not sharing water bottles and things that they've put in place for some of the summer seasons. You see, there's summer athletics is happening right now at the youth level, right? There's summer lacrosse, there's summer baseball, there's summer softball. And so that's kind of been our test to see if that's been successful. And so far it has been. There hasn't been, knock on wood, any type of outbreaks yet in the state, but that we're watching and monitoring that very closely.
So that would be up to us to develop protocols around those practices. At this point, whether we agree or not, you can take a position on it. We are moving forward with the understanding that there will be some games or sports playing. I don't know why we're bringing a big jamboree together, but that doesn't. But anyway, that's a different matter. We'll get there when we get there. But yes, we have to sort of work through. Fundamentally, are we going to participate? Okay, well, we just sit here through athletics. We know how important it is. It's outside, I guess, right? I think you can get some. So we'll be going along with the concept of participating in that, which brings the question about music and arts and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so with that, we would do the protocols. Chris, I'd be looking for you and Alicia along with us to come up with those protocols. So I don't think respectfully need the board to do that part of it, right? That's a process work. Things about letting fans on campus and so on and so forth is that's probably you can have different opinions on that. In all honesty, because you could say you get spread out. The whole thing doesn't make sense. Even if you're going to you're going to buses and playing other teams and all the rest of it. But I do think that it's important that we take whatever steps we can, and not to be congregating people. In my opinion, if we're not having guests on campus relatively and in buildings and stuff, I think if we could find ways to use that camera, videotape the games, have them done, I'd much rather actually not have spectators at games, home or away spectators. Let the kids play. And I'm sure we can find a way to watch the games in some capacity. But that's a smaller part of the bigger question.
DAF media is going to be real busy.
I said maybe
Thank
more
God
fun
for them.
the kids in this down having home.
Yeah. So it sounds like most is operational. I do think probably it'd be like anything. As the plans keep the board updated, they could probably provide you perspective.
Yeah.
Although the final decisions seem operational to me.
And any budget issues to bring any budgetary impact to bring forward.
Mike and then Dave?
Right, and that's what I was going to say. As you go through your meetings, if you discover that there are equipment additions for this COVID environment that are going to have budget impacts that needed to be addressed, just obviously bring them forward to the administration, and they can bring it to us as need be.
Dave?
Just following up on Mrs. Stein's question, budgetarily, is there differentiation yet between sports, archery, yes, badminton, no, or are they just looking at a general schedule?
No, so no differentiation between sports. They're still planning on running and offering all fall sports.
Thank you.
So then at some point, can we also get some understanding around if we're going to run sports, how we might run clubs and what that might look like? Because I do think for the kids in those clubs, it's as important as maybe for the kids who are playing a sport.
Yeah, that discussion was left off just the last day or two there in terms of there was different opinion on it, but I do think in general people want a wee bit of consistency and try and find a way, if I take the pulse of people, and probably I would too, try and find a way for the kids to participate in these other activities. Maybe not be the exact same thing, exact same way, but essentially try to find a way to have that.
I mean, I think if the argument is
Experience.
kids need to be in their sports for social emotional needs, there are kids who need their clubs for the same sort of social emotional need. And so, again, in an imperfect moment, it might be an imperfect solution, but I want those to weigh equally in terms of kids' needs.
Chris, I'm just curious, did they ever think of switching the seasons, like spring to...
So that's been discussed, and that's not off the table yet. I think that brings in a different set of circumstances. You know, we just had our spring athletes lose their spring season, right? And I think one of the fears is that if you move the spring to the fall, the risk of having those kids lose another season, I think, is one factor that they're taking into consideration. So everything's, as CIC would say, everything's on the table for discussion, including moving the spring to a different season or flopping seasons. But I think there are some concerns about that leads me to believe that they wouldn't do it. Sorry?
Can you tell me the answer by Friday?
Yeah, when will do they have a time frame on when they're
They're committed to letting districts and the EDs know early August what their plans are.
Mr. Burke?
As you have these conferences with the league, perhaps one thing that you could consider is that if there is a reduction of the fall sports season, if there is a way to expand the winter season in terms of the amount of teams, for instance, football and soccer get wiped out. Maybe the league can come up with an idea where instead of teams having one basketball team during the winter, they could have three to give kids, if that's a better environment to operate in because it's some months later, to create more opportunity if there is fall opportunity lost. Because I think there are going to be, obviously there are hundreds of kids in this district, thousands of kids in this county who haven't been on a field and been able to pull on a jersey for a long time. And I think to the extent that it could be forward thinking in terms of creating those opportunities, if more is forestalled in the fall, it would make everybody happy.
Yeah, I mean, again, the goal is for our students to be able to experience athletics in some capacity. So that's always the underlying theme when you look at education-based athletics.
So lastly, and just throw a bit of a wrench into things for fun, I think as we look at, like in July, saying, hey, where are you on fundraising, where are this, we also have to look at this as a discrete year. And so what flexibility are we giving kids and teams? Because as much as being on the field is important, kind of that team camaraderie is important. Socially distanced team camaraderie might be harder. No car washes, which car washes are about raising money, but if anyone's ever had the pleasure of being one, they're also about the kids having fun together. So I wouldn't be afraid, even if we're coming up for a general platform going forward, to look at this as a discrete year. And there might be exceptions to what we might think are, absolute rules going forward. But, you can't have a car wash, but you can do this, which we might not typically run. Or you can't fundraise before X, but this year you might be able to, so that you can, because you're not going to have a big fundraising party with everybody there. So whatever it is, and you'll know best, but I would not shy away from the idea that this is really we think at this point a discrete year, and we might have, to have our COVID rules. Anything else on athletics? All right. So thank you, Chris. Thank you for hanging in with us all day.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much.
We do have one public comment that's coming in, which is next on our agenda. So I will read it for the record. It's from CDSP. While we appreciate that the athletics conversation is happening today, it is incredibly frustrating to sit through this lengthy discussion without having access to materials that are being reviewed and discussed. A few disparate thoughts. Clearly, a 160-person football team with a no-cut policy has much greater fundraising power than an ex-member soccer team that does cut. Wants versus needs. When your wants replace the district-issue uniforms, etc., the other teams are still stuck wearing the optics are not good. We just heard the explanation that one sports budget doesn't affect the others, and the issue seems to be resolved. However, we have certainly heard parents cite examples where their athletes' uniform/equipment was not up to standard. Should teams be raising money to take a coach bus to games, even if they can? Smoke machine at football games like the NFL game. What is the process for approval of items like this? Who advocates for the needs of non-athletic extracurriculars? Are they adequately represented when it comes time to making for budget requests? We appreciate the importance of not pitting athletics versus non-athletic extracurriculars, and more transparency may help avoid this. Could we see a chart of funding for all extracurriculars, athletic and non-athletic? Is anyone reviewing all of the gentlemen's agreements in place with the Y, field rentals, et cetera, to determine if those are equitably benefiting athletes, teams, and families? Equity does not mean meeting the needs of each team. Equity means the quality of being fair and impartial. This raises the question of who decides whether a team will cut. If the coach chooses not to cut, is that a final decision? If a coach says, thanks for the offer not to cut, but I choose to cut, does that mean the needs of the team have been met according to the coaches? If so, is it equitable? Parents should know where fundraising dollars are swept into and what those funds are used to each school year. Can we have access to those spreadsheets? We would have loved to have heard more discussion today about what the fallout of these topics. For example, we often hear the discrepancies between the competition between DHS teams rather than creating overall blue wave spirit at DHS. Thank you, Julie Best, 38 Red Rose Circle, and Lori Olson, 16 Little Brook Road North, CDSP co-chairs. On public comment, we are going to try to get it live again because it's much better than me reading things into the record, but that is what we received today. So hopefully we'll be live and let people speak for themselves. I don't see any other public comment, so with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Stein?
Are we going to be meeting now together?
I think we're going to see how things play out. I think most of us would like to meet together as much as possible. I think what we are doing in this environment is leaving the Zoom option open as long as the governor's executive order still stands. Once that executive order changes, we may need to revert and or look at our policy. But I think Dr. Adley and I will talk. We'll see how today went. We can hear how you all felt about today.
Do you want feedback?
Yeah, I'm happy to take some feedback. I just feel like with the retreat, it was going to be very difficult to do online. Sometimes things are a little more pro forma, but we tried it today. There was some pushback, just so you know, and I'm not calling anybody out, but there were some concerns over doing it. So I want to give those people a chance to give feedback. But everyone's feedback is welcome, and we will do our best. We'll do our best. It'll be an imperfect solution inside of an imperfect moment, just like everything else. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Brown and Mrs. Stein, because I already called on her, and all in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.